They were a couple in the throes of newfound love. She was an attractive older divorcee.
She's an older woman. She knows what she's doing.
And he was the dashing man who promised her his body and soul.
He bent over backwards for her.
That was until a terrifying encounter inside her apartment exploded in violence.
This was an ambush.
And I just saw blood. I was scared out of my mind.
Leaving one man dead and another on the run.
It is mind-blowing. It's one of those moments where every time you think of it, it's unreal. Like, I can't believe that just happened.
But unraveling this sordid mystery would soon raise an even more alarming question. If push did come to shove, just who'd fire first?
I don't think that anyone could have seen this coming. Nothing of this magnitude.
Wednesday, May 13th, 2009, 7:30 a.m. It's a peaceful morning in a West Jacksonville, Florida apartment building when Ethan McNeil and his wife Jomisha hear a woman's blood-curdling screams pierce the air.
Did you hear that?
It happened so quickly, I don't know if I had a chance to think. She was screaming.
Within seconds, the unmistakable sound of gunfire.
I'm gonna go check that out real quick.
Wait.
I'll be right back.
Ethan cautiously opens his door and peers down the hallway. To his horror, he sees his neighbor, 36-year-old Dorothy Washington, cowering from a man he's never seen before.
And I saw the man, he had two guns, a silver one and a black one, and he was pistol whipping Dorothy.
In the wake of the violence, the McNeils find themselves unsure what to do next.
I know that she needed help, but I was frightened myself, my own safety.
I gotta call the cops.
Ethan and Jomisha decide the best thing to do is call 911. They're not the only ones. A flood of calls from concerned neighbors is already lighting up the dispatch switchboard at police headquarters.
Somebody's getting beat up real bad.
It's my neighbor. I think our boyfriend got a gun.
You have to be an emergency over there. Somebody need to get out here real quick.
The couple is awaiting the arrival of officers when they hear a sudden pounding on their door.
Wait.
It's Dorothy, with her two young daughters in tow.
Dorothy was right there in my face. You know, she was kind of hysterical.
The kids were very frightened. They were crying.
With blood streaming down her forehead, a terrified Dorothy tells the McNeils that her boyfriend, Michael Brooks, has just been shot and that the attacker has fled the scene. Though they know it could be dangerous, the McNeils decide to investigate.
I noticed that the door was cracked, so I pushed it open a little bit and just called out.
Hey, are you okay?
Hearing no response, the McNeils step inside the apartment and into a scene of unimaginable horror.
I noticed Michael on the floor, shot. He wasn't moving. He had a white t-shirt on, stained with blood, and I just freak out. I started screaming and panicking, and I ran back towards my apartment.
Moments later, the first officers arrive on the scene.
He was shot multiple times in the torso area. He was dead on the scene.
He's 291.
Officers must now begin two very difficult but very different tasks: scouring the apartment for evidence and notifying Michael Brooks, next of kin.
I just couldn't believe it. Actually, I thought it was a dream. He was somebody that was really close to me.
I wanted to figure out what was going on and why was my brother's life taken.
Once on the scene, detectives find themselves grappling with the same question.
Who called it in?
Everybody.
Examining Michael's body, they discover he's the victim of multiple shots from a .45 caliber pistol.
He's got 5 shots in the stomach.
There were .45 caliber shell casings.
Let me know if you found the gun.
Yes, sir, I will.
We did an extensive search, and we never located any weapons.
But what exactly could have sparked this deadly shooting? And who was responsible? To answer those questions, police will need to turn to the crime's terrified eyewitness, Dorothy Washington, and unlock the mysteries of a love affair just 1 year in the making. In July of 2008, 35-year-old Dorothy Washington attended the wedding of a friend at a church in Jacksonville. Invited to be the maid of honor, Dorothy couldn't help but notice one strapping man in attendance.
He was very athletic. Athletic build. He was cut.
Locking eyes with the handsome stranger, Dorothy introduces herself.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Dorothy.
I'm Michael. You are absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
Like Dorothy, 28-year-old tile contractor Michael Brooks had grown up in the Jacksonville area. And whether it was the wedding bells in the air or the champagne that was flowing, the pair quickly hit it off.
You want to come over and talk a little privately?
Yeah, why don't we do that?
It was very casual at first. You know, a flirty, touchy-feely type deal.
As they warmed up to each other, Dorothy found Michael's charm and charisma impossible to resist.
You're quick on your feet.
Shy a little.
I don't care what mood you were in. By the time you get with him, he'll turn your tears into smiles.
And despite the 7-year age difference, Michael couldn't deny his attraction to Dorothy.
I know that he felt that she was a very attractive woman. She also was independent, having a car, house, kept herself up. He was definitely attracted to that.
Do you mind if I get your number and give you mine?
I think that'll be good.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
From that night forward, Michael and Dorothy talked on the phone nearly every day. It was clear there was something special between them. But since Dorothy had 2 young daughters to consider, they decided to take things slow.
I miss you.
Yeah, I miss you too, baby.
Dorothy was always there, caring mother. She put her kids before, anything.
But tempering their red-hot desire for one another was easier said than done. And beyond Dorothy's children, there was another obstacle preventing her and Michael from letting their passions run wild.
I gotta go, okay? I'm gonna call you tomorrow. All right.
Michael, he was married.
And unfortunately, so was Dorothy. However, neither one of them were exactly in the throes of marital bliss.
Dorothy had been married for a while, cared deeply about her 2 daughters, but it goes sour.
My brother, he wasn't as happy as he was supposed to be in a marriage.
After months of concealing their feelings for each other, in the late fall of 2008, Michael and Dorothy decided to come clean to their spouses and file for divorce.
Michael adored Dorothy, felt that she was a breath of fresh air, especially dealing with all the problems that he was dealing with in his own marriage.
With their respective spouses no longer an impediment, the couple's relationship soon soared to new emotional and physical heights. In fact, Michael spent many days and nights at Dorothy's new apartment in West Jacksonville. The couple's chemistry clicked outside the bedroom too. Michael was mature beyond his years and happy to take on an adoptive family.
Everyone was accepting to the relationship because he was happy. Actually, I've never seen him that happy before. So as far as how their relationship was going, he loved everything about her.
Today's probably one of your best days, right?
By May 2009, life had never looked better. Not only did Dorothy have a strapping young man to come home to each night, Michael had found a woman as devoted to him as he was to her.
Dorothy and my brother Michael was building a serious relationship. They was getting along on a more advanced level.
Which is why police are so puzzled when they encounter the bloody scene on the morning of May 13th. And has them wondering who'd want to close the chapter on Dorothy and Michael's storybook romance in such a horrifying fashion.
I'm Michael.
Dorothy Washington and Michael Brooks were embroiled in a sizzling new relationship. But their life together ended one brutal morning in May 2009. When police found Michael gunned down inside Dorothy's West Jacksonville apartment. Dorothy had also been assaulted and was now huddled with her children on the neighbor's couch.
This was a straight ambush. It was stranger than normal cases because we had a living victim.
With the couple's assailant still at large and presumably armed and dangerous, no one would rest easy until he was found.
I was scared out of my mind.
But what triggered this deadly rampage? Finding no signs of forced entry into the apartment, robbery seems like an unlikely motive to police.
The victim was immediately inside the door, which indicates that he opened the door to go out, and he was immediately confronted.
There was no forewarning. Once my brother opened the door, he was murdered.
To detectives, the scene at the front door suggests one of two chilling possibilities.
Did this person knock on the door first, and then Michael Brooks open the door, or did Michael Brooks open the door and step outside and realize something was up?
Either way, it seems someone has intentionally targeted the couple. But who? While first responders race Dorothy to a local hospital,
can you tell me if they've had any kind of marital problem?
Police turn to Michael's grieving friends and family for answers.
He was having a really tough divorce.
Slowly, a few more details begin to emerge.
He might have been a little jealous against the other guy.
Apparently, Michael's ex-wife Felicia likened their recent separation to salt on an open wound.
Michael's wife, was very emotional.
Is it possible Felicia was so enraged over Michael's budding romance with Dorothy that she did something drastic?
When that one person falls out of love and the other one doesn't, then a lot of times a volatile, situation can come from that.
So volatile that detectives now speculate that the man who attacked Michael and Dorothy may have done so at Felicia's behest.
Anything's possible when love and passion are involved. She could have hired somebody to kill him.
But when police speak to Michael's estranged wife, Felicia, she seems genuinely devastated by the news of his death.
Michael Brooks was shot this morning.
Oh my God. Is he okay? Is he dead?
Sorry, but he is dead. When's the last time you seen Michael?
About 6 months ago when we separated.
Did you have anything to do with his murder?
Absolutely not. I loved him. I still cared about him.
Furthermore, it seems Felicia has already moved on with her life, making jealousy a flimsy motive at best.
Police realized pretty quickly that Michael's wife could not have orchestrated this attack.
But if Felicia isn't behind this attack, then just who is? Fortunately, one victim has survived this bloody episode. After speaking with Felicia, detectives head to the hospital where Dorothy Washington is now being treated for her injuries. Still in shock, Dorothy tearfully recounts the events leading up to the shooting.
Michael had spent the night there, the night of this incident. So when he woke up, he was actually at the apartment.
Michael and I were getting the kids ready for school. He went outside to have a cigarette. Are you ready, honey? Uh-huh.
Dorothy claims that almost immediately after Michael stepped outside, she heard a commotion. Before the front door suddenly burst open.
This is any woman's worst nightmare. She sought safety and retreated into her bedroom with the two daughters.
Pushing her daughters into a bathroom closet, Dorothy grabbed her .380 caliber handgun from the bedroom and locked the door.
He kicked the door in. It was Jeffrey.
Dorothy tells investigators that the attacker is none other than her estranged husband, Jeffrey Washington. Wild-eyed with rage, Jeffrey rushed toward Dorothy and snatched the gun away from her.
Dorothy was just as upset and frightened and just terrified. It was just a very scary scene.
Dorothy claims Jeffrey then pressed the gun against her forehead and pulled the trigger.
He tried to shoot her with her own gun, but it malfunctioned.
Dorothy says that once the gun jammed, she tried to make a break for it, but Jeffrey grabbed her and drug her from the apartment, their children hiding in the bathroom closet all the while.
He just kept hitting me and hitting me with both of the guns.
He's got the guns and he's wailing on her.
He hit her in the head again and he pointed his gun at her head.
He tried to shoot me again, and the gun jammed again. I was screaming so loud. The neighbors, they looked out the door.
Dorothy Washington actually put up enough of a fight and made enough noise to where she attracted the attention of the neighbors. And I think that definitely led to his fleeing the scene.
Bloodied and battered, Dorothy claims she darted back inside, grabbed her two daughters, and staggered to her neighbor's apartment for help. It It's a chilling story, and it sounds like Dorothy is lucky to be alive. Police issue an APB for Dorothy's estranged husband, Jeffrey Washington.
We put his face on the news as much as we could, as well as we contacted his family members, told them that we were looking for him.
Dorothy gives police the make and model of Jeffrey's car, as well as his home address. But for all their efforts, Jeffrey is nowhere to be found.
We got in touch with his girlfriend and searched her house just to make sure that he wasn't in there. He wasn't.
Police begin to fear an armed Jeffrey has fled the area. But then they receive a phone call from a concerned resident.
A school board employee called the police and said, "I don't know what just happened, but some guy just bailed out of a car behind a school that was being built."
Officers race to the scene and find the abandoned car, which is registered to Jeffrey Washington. But there's no sign of him anywhere. No one has any idea where Jeffrey is headed next, or what he might do.
This is a scary situation. This man allegedly killed his wife's lover and tried to kill her in front of their children. If that's true, then he's capable of anything.
But as detectives broaden their search for Jeffrey, they'll soon uncover a witness that contradicts everything Dorothy Washington had to say about the shooting, and leaves those closest to the case wondering, who really was the intended victim of this savage attack? Pair of failed marriages, Dorothy Washington and Michael Brooks formed a union that symbolized a second chance at true love. But their heart-stopping relationship came to a grisly end when Michael was shot dead inside Dorothy's apartment.
Just seeing him just laying there still, this is just crazy.
According to Dorothy, her estranged husband, 44-year-old Jeffrey Washington, had been responsible for the unprovoked attack.
Dorothy Washington actually stated that Jeffrey Washington definitely was the bad guy in this story.
Police find Jeffrey's abandoned car parked along a roadway near an area school. A school board member claims he saw a man get out of the vehicle and race into the nearby woods.
We utilized an air unit, as well as I called in the U.S. Marshal Task Force and bloodhounds. And the dogs did pick up scents and they started to track, but they did lose the scent when they got into the heavily wooded areas.
Investigators head into the thick woods on foot, well aware he's armed and possibly dangerous. But after hours of combing the area, they reach a dead end.
We searched all day long until about 8 or 9 o'clock that night.
While the manhunt continues into the following day, detectives try and flesh out the presumed motive behind the crime: jealousy. But interviews with Jeffrey's friends and family don't exactly paint a picture of a scorned lover capable of murder. Rather, Jeffrey is described as a deeply religious man who serves his community and is devoted to his children.
From all reports, he just seemed like he was a good guy, a man of faith, someone who was doing good work in the community that people had respect for.
A gifted cement finisher, Jeffrey even donated his services pro bono to help restore a historic Jacksonville cemetery.
He was a model of what a man should be.
No one can imagine Jeffrey killing anyone, much less pointing a gun at the mother of his own children.
Well, considering what we know of Mr. Washington, it seems out of character. It's almost unbelievable.
To investigators, Jeffrey's reputation as a gentle soul doesn't jive with the horrific crime he's allegedly committed. Then on May 15th, just 2 days after Michael's death, an unarmed Jeffrey Washington walks into the headquarters of the Jacksonville Police Department.
He turned himself in with his pastor and his cousin.
Jeffrey appears to be in a great deal of pain. To their surprise, police soon find out why.
We took him into custody. We brought him into the interview room to do the interview, and we realized at that point that he was actually shot. Jeffrey Washington's injury was actually a gunshot wound that went in on his side and actually went out the back.
While police are eager to get Jeffrey's version of events, it's obvious he isn't fit for a formal interview.
He knew he had been shot, and he was worried about bleeding to death. Because he was injured, I couldn't proceed with an interview without having him checked out by medical personnel. So we called rescue.
Paramedics transport Jeffrey to an area hospital. Fortunately for him, the bullet hasn't pierced any vital organs. After being cleared by medical personnel, Jeffrey's finally able to tell police his side of the story.
What is it you want to know?
How's your relationship now with Dorothy?
Jeffrey Washington and Dorothy Washington had been married for about 13 years.
There was still joint custody of the kids in terms of Mr. Washington would be able to have contact over the weekends.
Jeffrey tells police that at first, their custody arrangement worked out fine. But in the weeks leading up to the shooting, Jeffrey noticed his children acting differently.
Every time they come to me, they seem upset. Ever since you've been with this dude, Michael.
Baby, what's the problem? Daddy's here for you. What's going on?
According to Jeffrey, just days before the shooting, his 8-year-old daughter Amy begged her father to let her stay with him.
You don't look yourself. Why you not ready to go back to your mom's house?
I just don't want to go.
There's this outsider, an intruder, or a stranger who's doing the job that you feel you should be doing or could do better. And then on top of that, he's not even making them happy.
What's happening over there at the apartment? Please tell me.
Nothing.
In Jeffrey's head, you know, my daughter is hurt, is crying. This guy has to be doing something. Let me go over there and see what's going on.
Jeffrey states that in an effort to uncover the truth, he drove to Dorothy's apartment on the morning of May 13th. Jeffrey is adamant that he just went there to talk. But the moment he arrived, the situation started to escalate.
I just want to see my daughter, man.
Man, what you doing here, man?
I just need to...
You know you're not even supposed to be over here, all right?
Jeffrey stated that Michael was aggressive against him.
Don't you have a restraining order?
minutes.
I don't care nothing about that.
All I need to do is see my daughter. We start tussling.
According to Jeffrey, during the struggle, Michael fell backwards through the door of the apartment. At which point, Jeffrey claims Dorothy came after him with a gun. After that, everything was a blur. Multiple shots were fired. But all Jeffrey knows is that somewhere during the struggle, he was shot in the stomach.
He's bleeding, and just kind of a very surreal scene playing over and over, like, was that a dream?
Jeffrey tells investigators he eventually wrestled the gun away from Dorothy before striking her in self-defense.
He claimed he was over there not really to do harm, but that it escalated. It kind of got out of control, and so he was forced to defend himself.
Dazed, confused, and mortally wounded, Jeffrey then fled the scene.
I got in my car, went down the street. I jumped out the car in panic, ran in the woods.
Your heartbeat is racing, your mind is going in probably 100,000 different directions because I'm shot. Where do I go? Do I turn myself in? Do I keep hiding? Do I tell anybody?
As I was in the woods, I was continuing to bleed. So I just came and just turned myself in the police station.
He realized that he was shot because the adrenaline started to come down, and he knew we were looking for him. Things kept adding up to where he felt like I needed to go turn myself in, or I need to seek help.
For police, Jeffrey's side of the story raises a number of troubling possibilities. Could Michael Brooks have indeed been the instigator? Or worse, could he and Dorothy have conspired to lure Jeffrey to her apartment in order to eliminate him from their lives once and for all?
There's always more than one side to any story, and this story definitely had two sides.
But soon, new information will surface revealing a much darker side to this twisted tale, and will call into question everything detectives think they know about Jeffrey and Dorothy Washington. Dorothy Washington and Michael Brooks seemed to have it all. But their whirlwind romance came to a startling end when Michael was shot dead in Dorothy's apartment. To those close to him, Michael's death seems like a senseless tragedy.
I would think that my brother would pass away from some type of disease, old age, you know, something like that, but to be murdered like that.
Based on Dorothy's emotional version of events, her estranged husband Jeffrey Washington looks like a stone-cold killer. But when a gut-shot Jeffrey tells a different story, detectives begin to wonder if he could have been the intended victim in a far more twisted plot.
It doesn't appear that Dorothy cared for Jeffrey anymore. He could have gotten in the way of her getting custody of her kids. It is possible that they planned to harm him that day.
Hoping to unravel this mystery, police turn to Michael Brooks' family for answers. Still stunned by his sudden death, they find it difficult to believe that someone like Michael could have instigated this bloody encounter.
Michael, he was a great man. He was very understanding and very cool person to be around.
He was very social, very humorous, crack jokes all the time.
But given Jeffrey's story, police can't help but wonder if there was a side to Michael friends and family had never seen. They start asking some tough questions about his relationship with Dorothy and her daughters.
Any signs of physical abuse, especially with the two girls?
No, I mean, I can't imagine Dorothy would have her kids around anybody like that.
He's not an abusive person at all.
I believe that if they did not like him or if they had an issue with him, Dorothy wouldn't even have Michael stand with him.
Michael, man, he's real likable, you know, never raised his voice to anyone.
He was just your average great guy.
A background check on Michael seems to support friends and family's contention.
Michael had no criminal history. There was no record of prior violence.
Given Michael's squeaky clean record, police figure a background search on Dorothy isn't likely to be any more revealing. And while Dorothy's criminal record is indeed squeaky clean, investigators come across information that stops them dead in their tracks.
She had bought a gun, I believe, months earlier.
Records indicate Dorothy purchased a .380 semi-automatic pistol from a local pawn shop 1 month earlier. The same type of weapon investigators believe was used to shoot Jeffrey.
Jeffrey's gunshot wound was consistent with a .38 caliber weapon. Generally, people buy handguns for one of two reasons: to protect themselves or intended harm against someone else.
Either way, detectives decide it's time to bring Dorothy Washington in for another round of questioning, where they press her about the recent gun purchase.
Ma'am, did you purchase a gun?
Yes, I did.
But why?
Because I was afraid.
Afraid of who?
My crazy-ass ex-husband.
The evidence did indicate Mr. Washington had abused Miss Washington in the past. As a result, she had taken steps to get an injunction to keep him away from her.
I even got a restraining order and moved away just to get away from him.
She does everything she can in order to stay away from him, including moving to a place where she thinks he doesn't know where she lives.
She was afraid of him.
Pulling the couple's court records, investigators discovered Dorothy's story checks out. Still, they're curious about one crucial detail Dorothy left out of her initial statement. Just when and why did she shoot her estranged husband?
If you could just please tell us again what happened that day.
Like I said, I heard shots. I grabbed my babies and ran. Grabbed my gun and we hid in the bathroom. That's it.
Moments later, Dorothy said Jeffrey burst through the bathroom door looking for blood.
She was hiding at the two kids and holding her gun when she heard the bathroom door shatter open. She stepped out of the closet and pointed the gun at him and said no, and he yelled yes, and so she shot him.
Dorothy's statement seems to be corroborated when police conduct a thorough re-examination of the crime scene.
Her door was kicked in as well as her bathroom door was broken in, which lended credence to her story that the suspect actually came towards her and attacked her after he had shot and killed Michael Brooks.
It seems the pendulum has again swung back from Jeffrey being a potential victim to being the instigator of the attack. But did Jeffrey truly intend to murder his ex-wife and her lover that day? Pulling surveillance footage from Dorothy's apartment complex, detectives make a startling discovery.
We have him on video at the apartment complex walking around 5 or 6 hours before the incident ever occurred.
To investigators, Jeffrey appears to be casing his estranged wife's apartment.
You see on the video him just kind of walking around.
At 7 a.m., the video shows Jeffrey entering the apartment building with his hands in his pockets. And while the video doesn't show Jeffrey wielding a gun prior to entering Dorothy's apartment, it does when he emerges from the building minutes later.
We actually have him on video running with the gun in his hand towards his car. He got into his car and he drove about 1.5 miles from the scene.
The surveillance footage, the court order, the forensic evidence, it all leads authorities to one conclusion.
It does look like it's premeditated. I kind of went over there to confront this person.
Prosecutors charged Jeffrey Washington with first-degree murder, attempted murder, armed burglary, and aggravated battery domestic violence. News of the arrest has Michael Brooks' family breathing a sigh of relief.
I was very confident that Jeffrey was going to get what he deserved. I mean, he turned himself in, and, you know, all of the evidence was there.
But as the case heads to trial, it seems that confidence may be a bit premature. A new eyewitness is about to come forward with shocking information. Information that will explain once and for all what really happened inside Dorothy's apartment.
She stated that she observed the shooting of Michael Brooks.
It's August 2010, and Jacksonville resident Jeffrey Washington is on trial for his life. He's accused of shooting his estranged wife's lover, Michael Brooks, and bludgeoning Dorothy outside her apartment. A horrific event that unfolded before their two daughters' very eyes.
It was very traumatizing to the kids. You have the two most important people in their lives, damn near killing each other.
But with a gunshot wound of his own, Jeffrey's supporters contend he'd acted in self-defense. However, in opening arguments, prosecutors paint a much different picture. They assert Jeffrey had a history of physical violence, and when his wife finally left him for a younger man, he snapped.
Most men that abuse women got to have the control. You're my woman, therefore I have the right to do what I want with you.
They allege that on the morning of May 13th, Jeffrey's rage finally boiled over. Obtaining a .45 caliber handgun, he drove to Dorothy's apartment to put an end to her romance with Michael Brooks once and for all.
Jeffrey felt territorial, that another man is in the house with his ex-wife.
The defendant still wanted a relationship with Miss Washington. Our theory was that Michael Brooks had stepped outside and Jeffrey Washington confronted Michael Brooks, and that's when he shot him.
Hearing the gunshots, a terrified Dorothy took action to protect her children.
Dorothy Washington, being scared, grabbed her two daughters. She was trying to hide.
But after pumping 4 more bullets into Michael Brooks, Jeffrey went searching for his estranged wife.
Feeling that she was going to get hit and that he was going to do something to her, she shot him in self-defense.
Wounded and bleeding, Jeffrey wrestled the gun out of Dorothy's hands, pointed it at her, and squeezed the trigger. Miraculously, the gun jammed.
If the gun had not jammed, there would be 2 victims.
Jeffrey Washington, even though he had been shot, was able to grab the gun from Miss Washington and then started hitting her with the gun. She then ran out of the bedroom and ran outside seeking help in the hallway.
Jeffrey's attack on Dorothy continued in the breezeway until he spotted eyewitness Ethan McNeil and fled the scene. As for Jeffrey's motive, prosecutors assert the case boiled down to just one thing: jealousy.
He went there to do harm because he was jealous. And even though Dorothy Washington had taken every step she could to keep herself safe, he was still able to find her.
To back up their claims, prosecutors point to the previous restraining orders, the security footage of Jeffrey taken outside of Dorothy's apartment, and the fact that he abandoned his vehicle shortly after he fled the scene.
His actions showed you that he was someone who knew that he had done something horribly wrong.
To further support their theory about the crime, the prosecution calls Dorothy Washington to the stand, where she tearfully recounts the abuse she endured at the hands of her estranged husband.
He was an abuser, plain and simple. Once you do it once, you do it again and do it again.
Dorothy also details the horrifying moment when Jeffrey's abuse reached its zenith, and how in that split second she feared for her life and for the lives of her daughters.
Dorothy Washington was trying to protect herself and her children.
But contrary to Dorothy's claims, defense attorneys argued the shooting was self-defense. They assert Jeffrey had simply driven over to the building out of concern for his children's welfare.
Hey, I just want to see my daughter, man.
When confronted by an aggressive Michael Brooks, they said Jeffrey had no choice but to defend himself.
We don't know what was in play in Jeffrey's head. That could have just been, okay, my daughter is hurt, is crying. This guy has to be doing something.
To bolster their argument that Jeffrey was no cold-blooded killer, defense attorneys called not 1, but 12 character witnesses.
Jeffrey Washington had character witnesses, or people who spoke highly of him, said that he was not that bad a person, that this was kind of like an isolated incident.
The jury seems impressed. Seizing on their momentum, the defense decides to go for broke, calling Jeffrey to the stand to testify on his own behalf.
Jeffrey Washington had to testify in this case because all the evidence indicated that he was there. The only thing he could argue really is that this was self-defense, and that's what he did.
According to Jeffrey, his 2 daughters were his world, and he would do anything to protect them.
Jeffrey Washington was stating in the trial that he was trying to protect his children from Michael Brooks. He was alleging that Michael Brooks was abusing the children and that the children were telling him these kind of things.
Jeffrey also testifies that it was Michael Brooks who instigated the physical altercation that led to the shooting.
He testified it was in self-defense, that he really didn't go in there to do harm, but that it kind of got out of control. And so he was forced to defend himself.
Many in the courtroom find Jeffrey's testimony convincing. But under cross-examination, prosecutors assert Michael's injuries don't square with Jeffrey's self-defense claims.
Self-defense is not 5 times. Self-defense is 1 shot, I'm trying to get the heck out of here. 5 times, that's premeditation.
Jeffrey doesn't deny he pulled the trigger, but claims that he was so frightened and that everything happened so fast, he had no idea he shot Michael so many times.
Something's fishy about that. There's no way in the world you're not gonna remember shooting somebody 5 times and pistol whipping your ex-wife.
In a bold yet risky move, prosecutors decide to play their trump card. They called Jeffrey's now 10-year-old daughter, Amy, to the stand to testify.
You can't describe the feelings that's going on that's trying to turn on that little girl's heart right now. So what am I supposed to do? Do I tell my dad that I love so much, or do I protect my dad?
The answer soon becomes clear. Amy claims her dad gunned down Michael completely unprovoked. No yelling, no altercation, just cold-blooded murder.
This kid had the courage to come into court and testify, knowing that she is fingering the person who's sitting in that courtroom, her father.
In their closing arguments, prosecutors assert that this is a clear-cut case of premeditated murder, while Jeffrey's defense team argues that Jeffrey is a good man who was pushed to the breaking point by a combative young man who he believed was abusing his children. But as the jury breaks to decide Jeffrey Washington's fate, nobody knows which way the scales of justice will tip. Will the jury throw the book at him, or have sympathy on a man who would do anything to protect his children? In Jacksonville, Florida, 45-year-old Jeffrey Washington is facing a life-or-death trial. He's charged with murdering 29-year-old Michael Brooks and then repeatedly pistol-whipping his estranged wife, Dorothy. It's unclear which way the jury will rule, but after only 2 hours of deliberations, they announce they've reached a verdict. They find Jeffrey Washington guilty on all counts.
This was all planned out. He claimed self-defense, and fortunately the jury saw through that.
The prosecution insists that the brutal nature of the crime deserves the most severe punishment possible.
It was cold, calculated, and premeditated. He shot him 5 times. He then went on and tried to do harm, and did do harm by beating his wife. So that makes it really not just 1 victim, but 2 victims. So that's why we thought the death penalty would be the appropriate penalty in this case.
But rather than the death penalty, the judge gives him a life sentence with no possibility for parole.
I believe that Jeffrey got what he deserved.
To kill a man's spirit, to kill a man's dreams, I don't care how many characteristics and witnesses you have. The fact is you killed somebody.
Jeffrey has to answer by him taking my brother's life. That's something he have to deal with.
In the wake of the verdict, Dorothy Washington has tried to rebuild her life. But nothing can change the fact that the young man who captured her heart was gunned down in cold blood by the father of her children, a man.
The blistering Texas heat has a way of burying things, baking secrets into the parched earth until they are as hard and impenetrable as the landscape itself. For 38 years, the small, wind-whipped town of Oak Haven lived under the suffocating shadow of the Midnight Spectre, a name whispered by parents to keep their children inside after the sun dipped below the horizon. It began on a stifling August night in 1988, a night when the air was thick with the scent of ozone and impending rain. 16-year-old Sarah Jenkins, a girl with dreams as wide as the plains, stepped out onto her porch to catch a breeze, and in the space of a single, heartbeat-stopping minute, she vanished. There were no screams, no signs of a struggle, just a half-finished glass of lemonade sweating on the railing and a screen door swinging rhythmically in the rising wind. What followed was an investigation that would tear the seams of this community apart, a relentless, decades-long hunt that transformed a quiet, rural town into a breeding ground for paranoia, fear, and shattered trust. It became the definitive Texas cold case, a mystery that defied time, logic, and the best efforts of law enforcement, leaving behind a void that no amount of searching, questioning, or praying could ever fill. But the truth, as it so often does, was waiting in the silence, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the one moment when the weight of a lifetime of deception finally became too heavy to carry. The scene of the disappearance, a lonely ranch house on the edge of the sprawling scrubland, became a place of pilgrimage for those obsessed with the darkness that seemed to swallow Sarah whole. Investigators swept the fields, combed the brush, and turned over every stone for miles in every direction, yet the earth gave up nothing. The silence of the Oakhaven brush was absolute, a mocking void that swallowed footprints and secrets with equal indifference. The local police, under-resourced and completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the mystery, found themselves chasing ghosts. Every neighbor was a suspect, every passing stranger a potential villain, and the fabric of the community began to fray as the investigation stalled, then halted, then went completely cold. The case file, initially a slim folder of notes and Polaroids, grew into a multi-volume chronicle of failure, a testament to the agony of a family who had to wake up every morning to the same devastating question: where was Sarah? The years bled into one another, each anniversary marked by a candlelight vigil that grew smaller and more desperate as the hope of finding her alive flickered out, replaced by the grim, hollow ache of searching for bones. Oakhaven became a town defined by its loss, a place where people learned to walk with their heads down, eyes averted from the empty chair at the table and the silence of the woods. Whispers circulated about a local drifter seen on the highway that night, or perhaps a secret admirer who couldn't handle rejection, but these were just the flickers of a collective imagination trying to make sense of a nightmare. The Midnight Spectre was a ghost, a phantom that struck without a trace, leaving only the wreckage of a family and the long, bitter years of institutional deadlock. Detectives came and went, each promising a fresh pair of eyes, each leaving with the same look of defeat, their faces etched with the fatigue of a mystery that refused to be solved. The breakthrough, when it arrived, was as quiet and jarring as the disappearance itself. It came in the form of a rasping, labored whisper in a sterile hospice room, miles away from the heat of Oakhaven. An elderly man, known to the community as Silent Silas, a recluse who had spent his life repairing tractors and living on the periphery of town, was nearing the end of his long, unremarkable life. As the machines beeped their steady, life-preserving rhythm, the veil of his long-maintained persona began to tear. He called for a priest, then changed his mind, and finally, with eyes that seemed to be looking at something no one else could see, he confessed. He didn't just admit to the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins. He laid bare the entire, sickening choreography of that night, describing the shadows, the fear in her eyes, and the final, cold silence he had imposed on the town for nearly 4 decades. The confession was recorded, the tape rolling as the man who had been a ghost in his own town finally filled in the blanks of a nightmare that had haunted them all. The reaction in Oakhaven was instantaneous, a tidal wave of shock, disbelief, and long-delayed anger that washed through the town square like a physical force. People who had grown up in the shadow of the case, children who were born after Sarah vanished, were suddenly confronted with the reality that the evil they had heard about in ghost stories had been living right beside them, operating a tractor, buying groceries, and nodding at them as they passed. The revelation that Silas, a man they had viewed with a mix of pity and mild distrust, was the architect of their misery was a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical blow. The town had spent 38 years looking for a monster in the dark, only to find him in the light of day, a mundane, overlooked fixture of their own making. The fury that erupted was raw and unpolished, a collective scream of frustration that finally had an object, a name, and a face to attach itself to. As the authorities moved to secure the site indicated by the confession, the town descended into a state of surreal, high-stakes anticipation. The ranch house, once a monument to a tragic loss, became the focus of a forensic operation that felt like a surgical procedure. They began to dig, the heavy machinery churning up the hard, Texas soil, turning the field that Sarah Jenkins had walked on for the last time into a grid of evidence. Every shovelful of dirt was a gamble, a potential window into the truth that had been locked away in the dark for so long. The investigators moved with a grim, practiced intensity, knowing that this was the final act of a play that had run for nearly 40 years, the resolution of a tragedy that had shaped the identity of an entire generation. The silence that had once defined Oak Haven was now replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of excavators, a sound that felt like the heart of the town beating for the first time in decades. The forensic team, working through the oppressive, midsummer heat, uncovered the evidence that Silas had described in his final, gasping moments. Beneath the foundations of an old, abandoned shed that had long since been reclaimed by the brush, they found the remains, a small, intimate collection of bones, a piece of fabric that was once a blue dress, and the locket Sarah had been wearing the night she disappeared. The confirmation was swift and agonizingly definitive. The Midnight Spectre was gone, but he had left behind the physical, haunting proof of the crime that had defined the town's suffering. The discovery of the remains was not a moment of peace. It was a moment of absolute, crushing finality, the end of the mystery and the start of a new, painful chapter for the Jenkins family, who now had a place to lay their daughter to rest after 38 years of waiting for a miracle that would never come. The fallout of the confession rippled outward, touching the lives of everyone who had been caught in the web of the investigation. The detectives who had spent their careers working the case, the neighbors who had felt the cold hand of suspicion on their shoulders, the family that had lived in the perpetual, agonizing hope of an answer, all were forced to reckon with the reality of Silas's double life. He had been a master of invisibility, a man who had understood that the best way to hide a monster was to make him completely, utterly mundane. He had lived his life in the shadow of the crime, a silent, watchful presence who had been present at the vigils, who had heard the stories, who had felt the weight of the grief he had created, and who had never, not once, showed a flicker of remorse until the very last second of his existence. The trial, though Silas was already dead by the time it was set to begin, turned into a public, cathartic autopsy of the case. The records were laid bare, the story of the confession was read into the official history, and the truth of Sarah Jenkins's fate was carved into the record of the town. For the community, it was a necessary, painful cleaning of the wound. The mystery was over, but the ghost remained, a lingering, spectral presence that would always haunt the edges of their memory. Oak Haven would never be the same again. The innocence of that 1988 summer had been irretrievably lost, replaced by a permanent, cold awareness of what could happen in the silence of the night, and of who might be hiding in plain sight. The case was closed, the questions were answered, but the emotional scars, the deep, jagged indentations on the heart of the community, would take a lifetime to fade. As the dust settled on the final, official reports, Oak Haven attempted to reclaim its identity, to find a way to exist in the wake of the truth. They held one last, grand vigil, not for the missing, but for the memory of Sarah Jenkins and for the strength of a community that had managed to hold onto itself through the storm of the century. They remembered her not just as the girl who disappeared, but as the spark that had burned brightly in their history, a light that had guided them through the darkness of the mystery. The Midnight Spectre was dead, his name would be forgotten or remembered with disgust, but the life of Sarah Jenkins would live on in the stories they told their children, a reminder of the fragility of the peace they cherished and the importance of holding onto the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. The final, lingering image of the Oakhaven cold case was the site of the ranch house, now quiet, empty, and reclaimed by the landscape. The earth had been leveled, the shed removed, and the field left to the slow, steady rhythm of the Texas plains. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been spoken, and the town had been set free, but the silence remained, a constant, low-frequency hum that reminded everyone who lived there that they were survivors of a nightmare. They were the ones who had seen the truth, the ones who had felt the weight of the shadow, and the ones who had finally, at long last, stepped out into the light, forever changed by the memory of the girl who walked out onto her porch, vanished into the wind, and finally, after 38 years, was brought home. The revelation of the deathbed confession acted as a detonator within the social bedrock of Oakhaven, a violent, irreversible rupture that split the town into two distinct realities, the Oakhaven of the 38-year silence and the Oakhaven of the immediate, terrifying aftermath. In the days following the publication of Silas's final, gasping admission, the town did not experience the cathartic relief that one might expect from the resolution of a cold case. Instead, it experienced a total, systemic collapse of its communal identity. For decades, the community had clung to the comfort of the unknown, the idea that the evil which had taken Sarah Jenkins was a foreign, external force that had drifted into their valley, committed its atrocity, and vanished back into the vast, indifferent expanse of the Texas scrubland. To discover that the author of their collective nightmare had been Silas, the man who repaired their tractors, the man who had been a fixture in their social periphery for 40 years, was a psychological violence that the town could not process. The Oakhaven precinct, previously a place of quiet, administrative routine, transformed overnight into the eye of a hurricane. Detectives who had inherited the files of their predecessors, men who had spent their entire careers haunted by the ghost of Sarah Jenkins, were suddenly forced to grapple with a level of institutional shame that was almost absolute. The realization that they had been shaking hands with the killer for decades, that they had unknowingly interviewed him while searching for the very evidence he had hidden under his own floorboards, turned the station into a tomb of professional failure. Every coffee break, every shift change, every patrol briefing was colored by the crushing awareness that the Midnight Spectre hadn't been a phantom, he had been their neighbor, their mechanic, their fellow citizen. The sense of betrayal was not just personal, it was existential, a realization that the infrastructure of their small-town vigilance had been a total, pathetic failure. The Jenkins family, who had lived in a state of suspended animation since 1988, found themselves thrust into the center of a media firestorm that treated their private, agonizing resolution as a public commodity. For nearly 4 decades, they had been the tragic symbols of Oakhaven, their home a landmark of unresolved grief, their lives defined by the absence of a daughter who remained frozen in time at 16. Now, with the confession and the recovery of the remains, the world demanded a performance of closure that they were physically and emotionally unable to provide. The cameras were everywhere, peering into their windows, documenting the exhaustion on their faces, turning their private mourning into a series of soundbites. The resolution, which should have been a homecoming, felt more like a fresh violation, an intrusive, global spotlight that prevented them from ever truly processing the final, cold reality of what had been buried in the scrubland. As the physical excavation of Silas's property continued, the town became a theater of the morbid. The location of the old, dilapidated shed on the edge of the scrubland, once a place of mundane, rural neglect, became the epicenter of a dark, magnetic curiosity. Residents who had never given Silas a second thought now stood at the edge of the police tape, staring at the raw, overturned earth, trying to reconcile the image of the man they knew with the monster who had meticulously catalogued the life of a girl he had stolen. The psychological landscape of the town was being rewritten in real time. Every tree, every fence, every path that Silas had walked upon was now seen through a lens of predation. The townspeople began to look at their own histories, re-examining childhood memories, local gossip, and chance encounters, searching for the clues they had missed, the subtle tremors in the earth that should have warned them that a predator was living in their midst. The schools in Oakhaven became battlegrounds for a new kind of anxiety. Parents, who had lived through the fear of the late 80s and had passed that fear on to their children, were now faced with the devastating proof that their precautions had been, in many ways, an illusion. The Midnight Spectre had not been stopped by their alarms, their locked doors, or their watchful eyes. He had been protected by the very culture of normalcy they had so desperately tried to maintain. The teachers and counselors were inundated with questions from students who were suddenly confronted with the fragility of their world, the realization that the adults in their lives were not just infallible protectors, but fallible, blind participants in a world where a neighbor could harbor a secret as dark as the one Silas had kept. The classroom, usually a space of structure and order, became a vacuum where the past refused to stay buried, and the present seemed fragile and temporary. The media's obsession with the Oakhaven case brought a new, predatory element to the town, the rise of the digital true crime scavengers. These individuals, armed with smartphones, portable recorders, and an insatiable, algorithm-driven appetite for content, began to treat Oakhaven as an open-air crime museum. They stalked the property lines of the Jenkins home, harassed the investigators for details that were still under seal, and broadcasted live from the site of the shed, turning the tragedy into a serial narrative for a global audience. The town, which had spent nearly 40 years trying to survive in silence, was now being forced to survive in the glare of a million digital eyes. This external intrusion, this commodification of their suffering, added an extra layer of trauma to the resolution, a feeling that even their resolution was not their own, but something to be consumed, critiqued, and then discarded by those who had no stake in the survival of the community. Within the walls of the local church, the pastor struggled to find a language that could encompass the scale of the revelation. The congregation, which had spent years offering prayers for Sarah's return, now found itself at a loss for words. How do you integrate the truth of Silas, a man who had sat in those same pews, participated in the same communal rites, and offered the same greetings of peace, into a theology of grace? The betrayal felt absolute. It turned the concept of community into a hollow, dangerous fiction. The pews were emptier than they had been in years. The silence that followed the sermons was not one of reflection, but one of profound, lingering bitterness. The church, meant to be the heart of the town's moral order, had been revealed as a place where the wolf could hide in sheep's clothing, leaving the community to navigate the moral vacuum that followed the collapse of their shared, silent, and misguided faith. The investigation itself, now focused on the process of corroborating Silas's confession, forced a deep, forensic autopsy of the town's past. Investigators began to pull records from the late 80s, re-interviewing witnesses who were now in their 70s and 80s, trying to build a case that could stand the test of time, despite the death of the suspect. They were mapping out his life, his childhood in the county, his employment history, his interactions with local law enforcement, trying to see if there were other chapters to this nightmare that they had missed. The fear was palpable. Was Sarah Jenkins the only victim, or was the Midnight Spectre a more prolific predator than Silas had admitted in his final, dying hours? The investigators moved through the files with the caution of men walking on thin ice, knowing that every stone they turned over might reveal another, even darker secret that had been buried in the history of their quiet, rural town. The atmosphere in Oakhaven became thick with a strange, defensive skepticism. The townspeople, once known for their open, friendly, and informal style of communication, became closed off and guarded. People stopped talking to each other across fences. They stopped gathering in the town square. They kept their heads down, their eyes moving quickly, their doors locked tight. It was a secondary trauma, a protective reflex born of the realization that their sense of security had been an accident of history rather than a product of their own vigilance. They were living in the rubble of their old lives, and the act of rebuilding seemed like an impossible, daunting task. How do you go back to being a normal, functioning town when you have discovered that the foundation of your society was essentially a mask for a secret, decades-long cycle of violence? As the summer heat began to recede, the town entered a period of cold, clinical evaluation. The local council formed committees to address the legacy of the case, to talk about how to move forward, and to decide what to do with the physical remnants of the tragedy. But these meetings were often tense, unproductive affairs where the members of the community clashed over the meaning of what had happened. Some wanted to memorialize Sarah Jenkins, to create a space that would honor her life and acknowledge the pain the town had endured. Others wanted to erase everything, to burn the records, to level the sites, and to pretend that the case had never happened. The town was paralyzed by its own inability to reconcile its past with its present, a community split between the need to remember and the need to forget, both ends of the spectrum driven by the same, singular, and deeply human need to survive. Detective Miller, the officer who had taken the final confession, found himself caught in the middle of this societal disintegration. He was the man who had brought the answer, the man who had closed the case, yet he felt no sense of accomplishment. He saw the pain he had unleashed, the chaos he had invited into the town, and the way the truth had, in many ways, been more destructive than the mystery. He spent his days in the office, surrounded by the remnants of the case, listening to the tapes of Silas's final words, trying to find some nugget of humanity, some reason, some rhyme for the horror he had documented. But there was nothing, only the cold, factual, and profoundly disturbing account of a life lived for the express purpose of destroying another. Silas had been a cipher, a man who had built his life around the hollow, dark core of a crime, and Miller, despite his expertise, was left with nothing but the crushing realization that some mysteries do not contain a meaning, they only contain a void. The Jenkins family, in a final act of private, painful courage, made the decision to hold a memorial service, not for the girl who disappeared, but for the life they had finally, truly lost. It was a simple, quiet event held in the town cemetery where they had finally laid Sarah to rest. The mood was somber, heavy with the weight of 38 years of waiting, of searching, and of hoping. The townspeople stayed away, respecting the privacy they had so frequently violated during the search, leaving the family to find their own, small measure of closure. It was the only moment of dignity the town had seen in months, a quiet, profound contrast to the noise and chaos that had followed the news of the confession. In that moment of quiet, the town of Oakhaven finally touched the truth of its own story, recognizing that the only thing that mattered was the life of the girl who had been taken and the love of the family that had never, ever stopped trying to bring her home. As the leaves began to change and the air turned crisp, the Oakhaven of late 2026 felt like a place that was slowly, painfully beginning to learn how to exist in the shadow of its own history. The town hadn't healed, and it hadn't returned to the life it had known in 1988, but it had survived the fire of the truth. It had walked through the dark, and it had come out the other side. The Oakhaven that existed now was not a place of simplicity or innocence, but a place of knowledge and, in some ways, a place of hard-won wisdom. They were the survivors, the ones who had seen the darkness in their own backyard, and the ones who had finally, truly learned that the most important thing you can ever hold on to is the truth, no matter how much it hurts, and no matter how long it takes to find it. The cold case was over. The mystery was solved, but the memory of Sarah Jenkins and the story of the town that had lost its innocence would linger in the heart of Oakhaven forever, a quiet, persistent, and haunting reminder of the life they once lived and the price they paid to finally, at long last, be free. The final, lingering impression of this phase was the sense that Oakhaven had been permanently altered, its identity irrevocably fractured by the weight of what had been revealed. The silence that now permeated the town was not the silence of a secret, but the silence of a community that was finally, at long last, wrestling with the weight of its own existence. The truth had arrived, and it had demanded everything, taking away the comfort of the lie and the safety of the mystery, leaving the people of Oakhaven to inhabit a world where the shadow was finally, undeniably, their own. They were the people of the valley, the survivors of the long, dark night, and as the winter of 2026 approached, they stood together in the cold, clear, and unyielding light of a truth that had finally arrived home. The third phase of the Oakhaven unraveling was defined by the transition from the visceral, immediate shock of the confession to the long, grueling, and deeply bureaucratic process of forensic reconstruction. If the second phase had been about the collapse of the town's social reality, The third phase was about the cold, analytical deconstruction of the physical world that Silas had inhabited for nearly 4 decades. The local precinct, once a place of quiet, small-town law enforcement, now resembled an industrial laboratory. A specialized forensic team, flown in from the state capital, took complete possession of Silas's ranch house, their white, biohazard-suited figures moving through the dust-choked rooms like ghosts haunting a house that had been purged of its humanity. They weren't just searching for physical remains. They were searching for the psychological debris of 38 years, looking for the artifacts of a predator who had spent his entire life mastering the art of hiding in plain sight. The work within the ranch house was methodical, bordering on the ritualistic. Every square inch of the floorboards was pulled up, every wall panel was probed with acoustic imaging, and every piece of furniture was dismantled to see what secrets had been integrated into the material culture of his home. It was a deconstruction of suburban normalcy. They found the ordinary, the stack of unpaid heating bills, the collection of rusted engine parts, the jars of preserved vegetables in the pantry, all of which stood in stark, chilling contrast to the reason the house had been sealed off from the world. It forced the investigators to reconcile the man they had known as Silas, the man who would offer a polite, nodding greeting to the mailman, with the monster who had spent his solitary evenings documenting the silence he had imposed on the town. The house was no longer a home. It was a museum of a crime that had been kept in a state of suspended animation, a physical manifestation of a motive that felt less like a passion and more like a pathological necessity. Outside the perimeters of the ranch, the town of Oakhaven was struggling to maintain the most basic functions of civil life. The school board meetings, usually the venue for mundane debates about budgets and extracurricular activities, became arenas of raw, unfiltered anger. Parents, their voices cracking with the strain of suppressed trauma, demanded a total, immediate overhaul of the town's security infrastructure. They didn't want to hear about the legal process. They wanted to hear about how a man like Silas had existed in their midst for so long without a single alarm being raised. The school system, feeling the pressure, launched a series of safety and vigilance workshops, but these sessions quickly devolved into performative displays of communal anxiety. The reality was that the town's security had been a fiction. They were now navigating the wreckage of a social contract that had never been as strong as they had liked to believe. The media coverage, having exhausted the initial, frantic headlines, moved into a deeper, more predatory phase. Independent documentary crews, funded by the insatiable demand of the true crime streaming market, began to interview anyone who had ever had a casual conversation with Silas. They wanted to find the red flags, the subtle, unseen markers of his predatory nature that the town had missed. But their efforts were largely futile because Silas hadn't been a man of red flags. He had been a man of camouflage. His invisibility had been his greatest weapon, and the documentarians, in their search for a dramatic narrative, struggled to come to terms with the fact that there was no drama to be found in his daily life, only a chilling, consistent, and unremarkable banality. This realization that the monster was, by every external measure, a completely ordinary man, was more terrifying to the town than any Gothic horror story could ever be. Within the precinct, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly toxic, with deep-seated rivalries emerging between the detectives who had chased the Midnight Spectre, Ghost, for years, and the younger officers who viewed the old guard as fundamentally complicit in the decades of failure. The young, digital native investigators were unearthing old files, discovering misfiled tips, ignored leads, and instances where the police had actively dismissed concerns about Silas because he was a local fixture. This internal fracturing mirrored the wider societal divide. The badge, once a symbol of protection, now felt like a target, a symbol of the town's collective inability to see what was standing directly in front of them. The precinct was a place of high tension, low morale, and an overwhelming, suffocating sense of institutional exhaustion. The Oakhaven Historical Society, an organization usually dedicated to the preservation of pioneer artifacts and the genealogy of the founding families, found itself in the center of the debate over what to do with the physical history of the case. Should they archive the files of the investigation, or should they purge them? Was the history of the Midnight Spectre, a piece of the town story, or was it a stain that needed to be surgically removed? The debates were fierce, ideological, and deeply divisive. Some members believed that to forget was to dishonor the victims. Others argued that Oak Haven would never heal as long as it held onto the material records of the nightmare. They were caught in the classic, painful dilemma of the traumatized, the desire to remember as a way to understand, and the desire to forget as a way to survive. The physical landscape of the valley seemed to grow increasingly hostile as the season transitioned from the heat of late summer to the brittle, wind-whipped days of autumn. The ranch house, now an empty shell, stood as a jagged, broken tooth against the horizon. The townspeople took the long way home to avoid passing the site, as if the very air surrounding the property carried the contagion of what had occurred there. The fields, once a place of rural industry, felt haunted, the tall grass shivering in the wind like the ghosts of the search parties that had once combed them for a girl who was never going to be found. The environment had lost its innocence. It was now a place of consequence, a place where the history of the town's blindness was permanently etched into the dirt. As the forensic teams moved from the house to the surrounding acreage, the search grew increasingly meticulous. They were using ground-penetrating radar, looking for any other disturbances in the soil that could indicate the presence of other victims. The fear, the quiet, gnawing fear that Sarah Jenkins had not been the only one, was the unspoken engine of the entire investigation. Every time a shovel hit something hard, every time the radar pinged a potential irregularity, the entire town held its breath, waiting for the news that would shatter their already broken reality. It was a state of permanent, low-level emergency, a condition where the promise of a resolution was constantly overshadowed by the threat of a much larger, darker revelation. The Oak Haven Library, where the historical archives of the town were kept, became a sanctuary for the researchers and the writers who were obsessed with the case. They spent their days in the back rooms, piecing together the timeline, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. They were the ones who were trying to write the story of the town, not as a collection of headlines, but as a narrative of a community that had lived through the unthinkable. They were the ones who saw the patterns, who connected the dots, and who were the most vocal about the need for a total, systemic change in how the town viewed itself and its own internal vulnerabilities. They were the ones who were doing the heavy lifting of the truth, even when the town wanted to look away. Detective Miller, despite his exhaustion, found himself spending more time at the library than at his desk. He was trying to reconcile his own memories, the way Silas had looked when they interviewed him in the 90s, the way he had talked about his work, the way he had been the first to offer his equipment for the search, with the reality of the confession. He was trying to find the crack in the facade, the moment where the monster had slipped, where the performance had wavered. But he found nothing but the cold, calculated intelligence of a man who had known exactly what he was doing at every single moment of his life. Silas hadn't been a man who had lost his way. He had been a man who had chosen his way and who had stuck to it with a terrifying, absolute consistency. The families of the victims, the Jenkins clan, were retreating further and further into the quiet of their own lives. They had the answer, they had the closure, and they had the physical evidence of their loss. They were moving toward a kind of peace, but it was a peace that felt like a quiet, abandoned room. The world was still loud. The Oak Haven of their memory was still broken, and they were the ones who had to navigate the silence of the aftermath. They had the truth, and they had the justice, but they were still, ultimately, left with the reality of what they had lost, a reality that no amount of investigation, no amount of resolution, and no amount of explanation could ever replace. As the late autumn shadows stretched across the valley, Oak Haven felt like a place that was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out into the unknown. The case was moving toward its final chapters, the evidence was being organized, and the story was reaching its conclusion, but the town was not yet ready to accept the end of the narrative. They were still processing the horror and the magnitude of what had been revealed. They were still trying to understand who they were now, in the light of the truth, and they were still trying to find a way to exist in a town that would forever be known for the nightmare that had lived in its heart. The mystery of the Midnight Spectre was dead, but the ghost of Sarah Jenkins remained, a quiet, insistent, and ever-present whisper in the wind, a reminder of the fragility of the peace they cherished and the high price they had finally, at long last, paid to know the truth. The sociology of the valley's exhaustion was reaching its zenith. The residents were realizing that the truth did not bring healing. It brought a different, more complicated kind of pain. They were learning that a community is not defined by its secrets, but by its capacity to hold the weight of its own reality. They were a place of deep, unresolved tension, where every conversation felt loaded, every gesture felt guarded, and every day felt like an exercise in endurance. They were the survivors of the Midnight Spectre, and they were the ones who had to learn how to walk through the fire of the truth and still call the valley home. The silence that fell over the town at night was no longer the silence of the secret. It was the silence of a people who were finally, at long last, wrestling with the burden of their own reality, and in that wrestling they were finally, at long last, beginning to truly and deeply and permanently change. As the frost started to settle in for the winter, Oak Haven stood as a monument to the endurance of the human spirit. They had seen the dark, they had felt the cold, and they had survived the nightmare. They were the people of the valley, and they were the ones who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the only way to get through the night is to walk together, to look at the truth, and to refuse to let the darkness win. The case of Sarah Jenkins was no longer a mystery. It was a testament to the resilience of a people who had stood in the eye of the storm and had, against all odds, managed to survive. They were Oak Haven, and they were, at last, ready for the morning. They were the survivors, the ones who had seen the worst, and the ones who had finally, truly, found their way out of the dark. They were finally home, in the light of the truth, together forever. The fourth phase of the Oak Haven disintegration was the era of institutional reckoning, a period where the initial shock of the forensic truth gave way to a cold, systematic dismantling of the civic infrastructure that had permitted a predator to thrive for nearly 4 decades. If the third phase had been about the agonizing process of physical and psychological search, the fourth was about the brutal autopsy of the town's own soul. The residents were no longer asking, "What happened to Sarah Jenkins?" They were asking, "How did we let this happen to ourselves?" This wasn't a question of individual culpability alone. It was a radical, uncomfortable inquiry into the collective, suburban machinery that favored silence over substance and image over integrity. The town hall, once a place for routine municipal debates over zoning and tax levies, transformed into a permanent site of civic litigation where the citizens of Oak Haven finally demanded to know exactly how Silas had operated with total, unbothered immunity while living in the literal shadow of the law. The audit of the Oak Haven Police Department became the primary engine of this institutional firestorm. Investigators, no longer looking for a killer, were now looking for the institutional fingerprints of incompetence. They pored over thousands of pages of redacted files from the late 80s and 90s, uncovering a pattern of systemic dismissal that was as mundane as it was devastating. There were reports of suspicious vehicles near the Jenkins property that had been filed and then discarded as unsubstantiated. There were neighborhood complaints about Silas's aggressive behavior toward young women that had been minimized as minor interpersonal disputes. There was the staggering realization that the town's culture of politeness had acted as a filter, removing the dark, uncomfortable edges of reality and leaving behind a sanitized version of life that a predator could easily navigate. The badge, which for generations had represented the town's safety, now felt like a symbol of a deep, structural rot. The younger generation of Oak Haven, those who had come of age in the shadow of the cold case but had never known the town as a place of innocence, took the lead in this civic demolition. They formed the Transparency Collective, a grassroots organization that bypassed the traditional, sluggish channels of local government. They digitized the town's entire history, creating an open-source database of every public official's tenure, every contractor's permit, and every police record, allowing the public to see the web of connections that had linked Silas to the local power structure. This wasn't just activism, it was a digital, structural purge. They were tearing down the wall of institutional secrecy, ensuring that if a secret was ever kept in Oak Haven again, it would be impossible to maintain because every piece of evidence, every paper trail, and every public record would be immediately accessible to the entire world. This radical transparency created a profound, palpable anxiety among the town's older residents, the generation that had built the institutions that were now being dismantled. They felt as though their entire life's work, their contributions to the Rotary Club, their service on the school board, their loyalty to the local precinct, was being painted with the brush of complicity. They hadn't known about Silas, they protested. They hadn't seen the signs, they insisted. But the younger generation, fueled by the cold, hard logic of the audit, challenged this defense with a devastating question. If you didn't know, why didn't you want to know? The struggle between the desire to preserve the dignity of the past and the need to expose the reality of it created a social atmosphere that was, at times, physically combustible. The town square became a place where long-standing friendships were severed, where generational divides were carved into the bedrock of the community, and where the simple act of walking down the street felt like navigating a minefield of unspoken resentment. The school system, as the primary site of communal nurturing, was forced to undergo a, sometimes agonizing, period of transformation. The curriculum was revised to include the ethics of observation, a program that moved away from the traditional, passive model of education toward one that prioritized critical awareness and the responsibility of the citizen to monitor their own community's health. The students were no longer taught that Oak Haven was a perfect, protective cocoon. They were taught that it was a, sometimes, dangerous and deceptive place, and that the only way to survive it was to be active, skeptical, and profoundly present for one another. They were being raised in the ruins of their town's innocence, and they were, in many ways, the most robust, if cynical, generation the town had ever produced. Not because they had been spared the truth, but because they had been forced to eat it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The economic reality of Oak Haven also shifted, mirroring the sometimes hollow and defensive psychological state of the community. The businesses that were now succeeding were the ones that prioritized absolute, radical, and sometimes abrasive transparency. The Oak Haven Cooperative was formed, a group of local merchants who pledged to operate under a policy of total disclosure, where their products came from, how they were funded, and who they were connected to. They were, in essence, trying to market the town's honesty as its new primary resource. It was a lean, hard-won economic model, but it was one that felt, for the first time in years, completely genuine. They weren't trying to sell the town as a place of pastoral charm anymore. They were selling it as a place that had survived the impossible and that had the scars to prove it. The psychological landscape of the valley was also marked by a new, intense focus on the bridge circles. These were non-structured, informal gatherings where different generations, the survivors of the 1988 disappearance, the investigators who had worked the case, and the students of the Transparency Collective, met to share their experiences. It wasn't about solving the mystery anymore. It was about the, sometimes, brutal process of holding space for one another's grief. They talked about the fear, the anger, the sense of betrayal, and the slow, agonizing journey toward understanding. These circles became the glue of the fourth phase. They allowed the town to acknowledge its history as a living, continuous, and, sometimes, contradictory reality, rather than a chapter that could simply be closed and forgotten. It was the town's way of saying, we know what we were, and we know what we've become, and we are going to walk through the fire of the truth together. Thorne, in his final months of documenting the town's evolution, sat in the center of the town square, watching the daily life of the valley. He saw the way the community had built something that was, in the most essential way, a reflection of its own shattered identity. They weren't a perfect community, and they weren't even, perhaps, a very happy one. But they were, for the first time, a community that was looking at the truth in the face without blinking. They were a place that had refused to be defined by the worst of what had happened to them, and in doing so, they had built something that was, in its own fractured way, a monument to the endurance of the human spirit. They were finally, truly, in the world, a real place, filled with real people, struggling with real problems, and finding their own, unique and necessary way to survive. The fourth phase of the Oak Haven unraveling was, therefore, not the end of the story. It was the arrival of the town into a state of post-trauma maturity. They were no longer the town of the cold case. They were the town of the recovery. They had been forced to learn how to exist in the harsh, unrelenting light of the truth, and they had come out the other side as a place that was capable, resilient, and, most importantly, alive. They were a place that had refused to be defined by the worst of what had happened to them, and in doing so, they had built something that was stronger, deeper, and more meaningful than the suburban illusion they had once so desperately clung to. They were finally, truly in the world, a real place, filled with real people, struggling with real problems and finding their own, unique and necessary way to survive. As the dusk deepened, the town of Oak Haven settled into the comfortable, routine silence of a place that is at peace with its own reality. The lights of the valley twinkled like stars on the ground, each one representing a home, a life, and a story. The case, the 38-year search, the investigation, the trial, the mourning, the rebuilding. It had all been a long, dark, and necessary ascent. They had climbed out of the shadow, and they had finally, at long last, reached the summit. They were standing in the light of their own, honest, and hard-won morning. The story was theirs. The future was theirs. And for the first time since that August day in 1988, the town of Oak Haven was not just a place where the people lived, but a place where they belonged to one another in the open and in the light of an enduring and entirely, mercifully, clear understanding that they had made it. They had reached the end of the nightmare, and in the waking, they had found that the only thing that matters, in the end, is the simple, persistent, and unshakable truth of the connections we choose to build. The final, lingering feeling of the fourth phase was one of arrival. The storm had passed, the wreckage had been cleared, and the town was starting to put down new roots. They were still damaged, yes. The history of their trauma would always be a part of who they were, a permanent, indelible, and necessary layer of their communal identity. But they were no longer defined by the loss. They were defined by the recovery. As the sun set over the valley, casting a long, warm, and utterly peaceful light over the roofs of Oak Haven, the town felt like a testament to the idea that the human spirit, even when it has been lied to, betrayed, and pushed to the very brink of destruction, can, with enough time, enough honesty, and enough collective work, eventually pull itself back from the abyss. The story of the cold case was now a chapter in their history book, a piece of the past that they could finally, at long last, put away, and as the lights of the town turned on, one by one, against the gathering dark, they weren't just lights in the night. They were the signals of a people who were finally, and at long last, safe. The mechanics of this stabilization were complex, involving a shift from reactive security to proactive community care. The Oak Haven model, as it came to be known, was based on the premise that a community's safety is directly proportional to the depth of its interpersonal connections. They had learned that the predator thrives in the margins, and they had committed themselves to eliminating those margins entirely. They created a network of community stewards, not authority figures, but neighbors whose role was to ensure that no one, no matter their age, background, or social status, was allowed to drift into a state of total, dangerous isolation. It was a subtle, almost invisible, but constant pressure that prevented the buildup of the kind of psychological alienation that had been the precursor to Silas's crimes. They had recognized that the predator requires a vacuum, and they had committed themselves to filling that vacuum with the constant, steady, and protective presence of one another. This, then, was the final achievement of the fourth phase, the construction of a communal immune system. They had learned that the most important thing they could ever build was not a fence, or a wall, or a system of laws, but the simple, unshakable habit of looking out for one another. This was the final and most significant result of the cold case. They had learned how to be a community, and in doing so, they had finally, truly, and at long last, become a place where the people of Oak Haven could, finally, begin to truly live. The silence that fell over the town at night was no longer the silence of a secret. It was the silence of a community that was, at long last, at peace with the truth, with itself, and with the shadow that it had finally, and for good, stepped out from under. The legacy of Sarah Jenkins, meanwhile, had moved from being a source of public, performative grief to something deeply personal and profound. The scholarship that the family had established was now awarded not to the student with the best grades, but to the student who had, in some quiet, unheralded way, made the town a kinder, more observant, or more protective place. It was a tangible, living, and breathing legacy. Sarah was no longer a symbol of what they had lost. She was the catalyst for the virtues they were now trying to cultivate. She had become, in the most essential and necessary way, the town's conscience. As the years of the fourth phase flowed on, the town of Oakhaven reached a state of profound, settled equilibrium. They had survived the disappearance, they had survived the media, they had survived the internal fracturing, and they had survived the exhausting and necessary work of the truth. They were, in the most fundamental way, a new community. They had learned that the most important thing they could ever build was not a fence or a wall or a system of laws, but the simple, unshakable habit of looking out for one another. This was the final and most significant result of the cold case. They had learned how to be a community, and in doing so, they had finally, truly, and at long last, become a place where the people of Oakhaven could, finally, begin to truly live. The silence that fell over the town at night was no longer the silence of a secret. It was the silence of a community that was, at long last, at peace with the truth, with itself, and with the shadow that it had finally, and for good, stepped out from under. The fourth phase of the Oakhaven unraveling was not a destination, it was a baseline. It was the starting point for a new, fundamentally more stable, and more human existence. They had survived the long, dark night, and they had found, in the breaking of the light, the truth of their own, enduring and irreducibly communal nature. They were the residents of a place that had refused to be defined by the worst of what had happened to them, and in doing so, they had built something that was, in every meaningful way, a testament to the power of the truth to not just reveal, but to restore. They were finally, truly in the world, a real place, filled with real people, struggling with real problems and finding their own, unique and necessary way to survive. The story of their recovery was complete, and in its completion, they had finally, at long last, become the kind of place where a life could truly, freely, and safely begin, a place where the light was not just a hope, but a habit, and where the truth was not just a discovery, but the very air they breathed every single day, forever. The fifth phase of the Oakhaven unraveling was the era of integration, a period where the community transitioned from a state of collective, surgical trauma recovery into a state of structural, permanent vigilance. If the fourth phase had been about the brutal dismantling of their illusions and the audit of their institutional failures, the fifth phase was about the synthesis of that knowledge into a new, defensive communal DNA. The residents of Oakhaven no longer viewed the 38-year mystery as a historical anomaly or a closed file. They viewed it as a foundational, albeit painful, lesson in the mechanics of human isolation. The town had successfully moved from the period of desperate, frantic reconstruction into a period of calm, structural stability, where the lessons of the Sarah Jenkins case were woven into the very fabric of their everyday existence, acting as a permanent, invisible, and highly sophisticated immune system. Detective Miller, now serving as the unofficial archivist of the town's communal memory, spent his days in the local library, not looking for evidence, but organizing the pedagogical history of the Oakhaven recovery. He had become the sentinel of their history, ensuring that the void that Silas had once filled with his presence was forever blocked by the memory of the cost of their ignorance. He understood that the greatest threat to a community that has survived a trauma is the tendency to drift toward the comfort of amnesia. The human instinct is to bury the painful, to forget the uncomfortable, and to return to the baseline of pleasantry. Miller's mission was to ensure that the ethics of observation, the culture of vigilance they had cultivated, remained a permanent, non-negotiable part of the Oakhaven character. He was the guardian of the town's conscience, ensuring that they never again mistook politeness for security. In the downtown district, the business community had stabilized into a unique, sustainable model that eschewed the volatility of the outside market. The local merchants had formed a cooperative, a community trust, which prioritized local engagement over growth. They had learned the hard way that their fragility was a byproduct of their isolation from one another. By creating a literal and figurative network of mutual support, They had ensured that Oak Haven would never again be vulnerable to the economic or social disruptions that had left them exposed in the late 80s. They were a community that did not look for investors. They looked for neighbors. This economic independence was the final, and perhaps most subtle, form of protection against the kind of predatory influence Silas had once wielded. As a community that is deeply invested in itself is a community that is impossible to isolate or manipulate from the margins. The school system, having fully internalized the curriculum of civic resilience, was now the town's crown jewel. The curriculum had expanded to include the sociology of safety, a multidisciplinary study of how communities function, fail, and succeed. The students were taught the mechanics of their own town's history, not as a moral fable, but as a practical guide to citizenship. They understood that the town of Oak Haven was not a given, it was a construction. They were the engineers, the builders, and the maintainers of the Oak Haven project. This ownership, this sense of responsibility, was the final death knell for the apathy that had been the predator's greatest ally. The young people of Oak Haven were not just citizens, they were stewards of their collective well-being. The internal life of the valley, the way people treated one another in the mundane, everyday interactions, had reached a state of beautiful, hard-won normalcy. The bridge circles, which had been so essential in the fourth phase for mediating the tensions between the generations, had evolved into a permanent feature of civic life. They were no longer focused on trauma, they were focused on communal projects, the maintenance of the town's parks, the oversight of the community trust, the planning of the annual Vigilance Day. They had successfully transitioned from a community of survivors to a community of collaborators. The trauma had served its purpose, it had broken them open, but the community had taken that brokenness and used it to connect to one another in a way that was fundamentally more durable than the polite, superficial connections of the past. However, even in this state of integration, there remained the ghost of the doubt. The town remained a place that looked at the world with a permanent, healthy skepticism. They were never again going to be the perfect Oak Haven. They were the Oak Haven that knew the price of perfection. This skepticism was not a burden. It was a feature of their communal hygiene. It was the check-in culture, the practice of stopping, observing, and actively engaging when things didn't seem right. It was a cultural habit that ensured that if any shadow, no matter how small, no matter how clever, attempted to take root, it would be seen. It was the town's permanent, collective defense mechanism against the return of a predator. Miller, in his final correspondence with his former department, articulated the Oak Haven model for a broader audience. He argued that the true solution to the cold case phenomenon was not better technology, but better community. He posited that predatory behavior thrives in the silence of the neighbor, and that justice is not something a detective achieves after a crime. It is something a community maintains before the crime can occur. His writing caught the attention of sociologists and urban planners from across the country, turning Oak Haven into an unlikely academic pilgrimage site. The town, which had once been the site of a horrific, multi-decade mystery, was now being studied as the site of a profound, radical, and necessary human triumph over the isolating forces of modern life. The Jenkins family, for their part, had reached a state of quiet, dignified grace. They were no longer the victim's family in the eyes of the public. They were the members of the community who had paid the most, and whose sacrifice had been the catalyst for everything that followed. They walked the streets of Oak Haven with the knowledge that their tragedy had, in some paradoxical way, saved their neighbors. It was a heavy, complicated grace, but it was grace nonetheless. They had found a way to honor Sarah's memory without being defined by her death, a feat that, for anyone who has lost a loved one to a senseless crime, is perhaps the ultimate, most difficult human achievement. As the 5th year of the integration reached its conclusion, the town of Oak Haven felt like a place that had found its center. The valley, once the site of so many dark, hidden, and terrible secrets, was now a place of expansive, vibrant light. The trees in the scrubland, where the shed had once stood, were casting wide, protective shadows, and the air felt clean, clear, and honest. The townspeople went about their lives with the steady, practiced rhythm of those who have faced the truth and have chosen to keep living. They were not just a town. They were a testimony to the fact that, even in the most broken places, the potential for light remains, provided that we are willing to do the work to find it, keep it, and share it. The final realization of the fifth phase was that the cold case was no longer a case. It had become a truth. It was a piece of their collective soul that had been reclaimed, integrated, and understood. The mystery had been replaced by the history, and the fear had been replaced by the vigilance. As the lights of the valley twinkled into the darkness, they were no longer signals of a town trying to hide from itself. They were the lights of a community that was, at long last, truly, fundamentally, and entirely home. The work of integration was complete. The past was settled. The future was open. And, in that, they found not just the safety they had once so desperately longed for, but a way of being with one another that was finally, profoundly, and permanently human. The sociology of integration. Deepening the narrative. In this phase of integration, the most profound development was the internalization of the witness. Every citizen had become, in their own way, an active participant in the town's communal health. The ethics of observation had become the town's common sense. It wasn't taught anymore, it was assumed. This is the hallmark of a healthy community, when the necessary practices of safety, transparency, and accountability are no longer the object of debate, but the baseline of expectation. They had reached the level of social maturity where the health of the community was treated with the same instinctive, protective concern as the health of the individual. Miller observed that the hidden motive, that dark, predatory desire to isolate and manipulate, had been stripped of its oxygen. By choosing to be transparent, by choosing to be connected, and by choosing to be accountable, Oakhaven had made it impossible for such a motive to survive. The predator's power relied on the silence of the environment, and by breaking that silence, by making the environment loud, clear, and honest, they had made the predator's existence impossible. It was a simple, elegant, and entirely devastating defeat of the darkness. As the winter arrived, the town of Oakhaven settled into a period of quiet, enduring peace. They were a place that had seen the worst, that had learned the hardest lessons, and that had built something that was stronger than their own fears. They were the people of Oakhaven, and as the snow fell over the valley, burying the traces of the past and preparing the ground for the new growth of the spring, they were the proof that the most resilient force in the universe is not the darkness of the secret, but the persistent, enduring, and ultimately triumphant light of the truth. They were home. They were together. They were the light. The fifth phase was the final, perfect, and necessary conclusion to the long, dark, and winding road they had traveled since that August day in 1988. The cold case was not just solved, it was understood, it was integrated, and it was lived out. And in that living, they had finally, at long last, achieved the only kind of justice that truly matters, the justice of a life lived in the light, in the open and together. The valley was theirs, the future was theirs, and the story of Oakhaven was, finally, one of truth, one of life, and one of love. The cold case was behind them, and the story of Oakhaven, as a community of truth, had finally, beautifully, and forever begun. The internal structure of their social life had also undergone a quiet, radical transformation. They had established the Citizens' Assembly, a rotating, representative group that met quarterly to evaluate the health of the community. It wasn't a governing body, but a sounding board, a place where any resident could bring forward a concern, no matter how small. It was a mechanism for the early detection of the kinds of stresses that had once been the breeding ground for the Midnight Spectre. By providing an outlet for the minor, daily frustrations of communal life, they were preventing the buildup of the resentment that can, in time, become dangerous. The assembly was the practical application of their new, defensive philosophy. It was the recognition that a community is not a static object, but a dynamic, ever-changing process that requires constant, intentional maintenance. It was the formalization of the ethics of observation, a way of ensuring that the town remained, at its core, a place where people were seen, heard, and valued. It was the final and most significant achievement of the fifth phase, the institutionalization of communal kindness as a strategic imperative. As the fifth year reached its conclusion, the people of Oakhaven looked back on their history, not with the desire to change it, but with the gratitude of those who had survived it. They had lived through the disappearance, the investigation, the trial, and the agonizing process of recovery, and they had emerged on the other side as a stronger, more connected, and more authentic people. They were a place that had refused to be defined by its trauma, and in doing so, they had built something that was, in every meaningful way, a testament to the power of the human spirit to find the truth, to honor the dead, and to build a future that is worthy of the life they once lived. They were a community that was defined not by what they had lost, but by the fact that they had refused to let that trauma define the limits of their love. They were the people of Oakhaven, and as the lights of their town flickered on in the twilight of the 5th year, they were proof that the most resilient force in the human experience is not the hunger of the predator, but the quiet, persistent, and unshakable desire of the community to be whole. The case was closed, the secret was solved, and the town was safe, not because they had achieved a perfect, untouchable order, but because they had finally, truly, learned how to live in the reality of their own existence, together in the open and in the light of an honest, hard-won, and entirely, mercifully, clear morning. The story of their recovery was complete, and in its completion, they had finally, at long last, become the kind of place where a life could truly, freely, and safely begin, a place where the light was not just a hope, but a habit, and where the truth was not just a discovery, but the very air they breathed every single day forever. The 5th year ended with a quiet, reflective celebration. It wasn't a day of parades or grand speeches. It was a day of small, meaningful gestures. It was a day where neighbors visited neighbors, where the schools hosted small, student-led presentations on the importance of community, and where the library remained open late into the evening, its doors unlocked, its lights bright, a symbol of the town that had finally, and for good, stepped out from under the shadow of the secret. They were a place of light, a place of truth, and a place of belonging. They were Oakhaven, and they were, at last, home. And as the fire in the town square dimmed to glowing embers, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the final, quiet assurance that the valley was at peace, the secret was buried, and the light, for as long as they remained together, would never, ever go out. The 6th phase of Oakhaven's post-unraveling journey was defined by the transition from integration to legacy. If the previous years had been about the agonizing surgery of truth and the subsequent, delicate grafting of a new communal identity, the 6th year was about ensuring that the scar itself remained a teacher. Oakhaven had successfully shed its identity as a site of tragedy. It was now a living, breathing blueprint for a community that had refused to be destroyed by its own history. The town was no longer looking for validation from the outside world, nor was it defined by the morbid curiosity of the true crime industry. It had reached a state of communal self-actualization, where the values they had forged in the furnace of the Sarah Jenkins case were being passed down, not as a lecture, but as a lifestyle. The residents moved through the world with the quiet, grounded confidence of people who knew that their peace was not an accident. It was a construction, a daily, deliberate act of collective willpower. Detective Miller, now a figure of near-mythic status in the town's oral history, reached the final stages of his chronicle. He wasn't just writing about the Silas case anymore. He was documenting the sociology of the town's resilience. He spent hours in the local archives, mapping out the progression of the ethics of observation. He wanted to prove, for the sake of future generations, that their survival wasn't a matter of divine intervention or luck. It was the result of the town's decision to replace secrecy with radical accessibility. He found that the most important archives weren't the police files, but the records of the bridge circles and the town hall meeting transcripts, the messy, unscripted documentation of how real people, under extreme pressure, had chosen to trust one another. He realized that this, and not the deathbed confession, was the true triumph. The town's educational infrastructure, specifically the high school's Civic Resilience program, had become the envy of the region. They weren't just producing students who could pass exams. They were producing citizens who could navigate the complexities of social survival. The students were engaged in long-term observational studies of their own community, analyzing the health of the local economy, the efficacy of the town's social support systems, and the persistence of communal engagement. They were the first generation in Oak Haven to approach their town not as a backdrop for their lives, but as a project that demanded their active, creative stewardship. They were, in the most profound sense, the ultimate insurance policy against the return of the predator. They were the ones who knew that if a problem arose, they were the ones who had to solve it. The economic model of Oak Haven had settled into a sustainable rhythm that favored small-scale, high-integrity operations. The local business council had implemented a community impact charter, which ensured that any new enterprise seeking to open in the valley had to demonstrate not just financial viability, but a commitment to the town's social health. This wasn't a suppression of commerce, it was a protection of the community's integrity. They had learned that a business that doesn't care about its neighbors is a business that doesn't care about the safety of the valley. This economic philosophy was the final, structural safeguard against the influence of predatory, isolated actors. They were, in the most literal sense, a town that put its people before its profit, and in doing so, they had created a prosperity that was as durable as it was honest. As the 6th year progressed, the town's relationship with the valley's geography reached a state of spiritual restoration. The landscape, once tainted by the memory of the search parties and the location of the shed, was now completely reclaimed. The reforestation project in the scrublands had hit a milestone. The saplings were now tall, resilient, and thriving, creating a canopy that felt like a sanctuary. The town's residents used the woods for everything from morning meditations to the annual Vigilance festivals, where the focus was entirely on the future. They had successfully overwritten the map of their trauma with the map of their daily, joyful, and necessary existence. The land was no longer a witness to a crime. It was a participant in the town's recovery. However, the 6th year also brought a poignant moment of transition. The last of the old guard, those who had been in positions of authority during the 1988 disappearance, began to formally step down from their remaining civic roles. This was the final passing of the torch. The leadership of Oak Haven was now fully in the hands of those who had learned the lessons of the cold case, not as an experience, but as a historical, foundational truth. It was a moment of profound, quiet significance. The era of the unexamined town was officially, finally, and entirely over. The town was now governed by a generation that had never known the silence, and because they had never known it, they were the most committed to ensuring it never returned. Miller, in his final correspondence with his peers in the forensic field, laid out a challenge that would define the rest of his legacy. He wrote that the Oak Haven case was not a cold case at all, but a cold community case. He argued that the forensic evidence only became useful once the community had regained its ability to speak to itself. He was shifting the focus of law enforcement from the technical pursuit of the perpetrator to the proactive cultivation of the community's social fabric. He believed that the detective's job of the future was not just to catch the criminal, but to identify the broken communal link that allowed the crime to happen in the first place. It was a revolutionary idea, and it was one that Oak Haven had proven to be the only path toward true, long-term safety. The Jenkins family, by this 6th year, had largely receded from the public eye, their mission accomplished. They had seen the town through the trial, they had seen it through the rebuilding, and they had seen it through the long, agonizing process of finding its own new center. They were now just residents, living their lives, enjoying their grandchildren, and participating in the mundane, beautiful, and necessary work of being members of a community. Their presence was no longer a sign of grief, but a sign of endurance. They had transformed their loss into a gift that was now so deeply embedded in the life of the town that it was simply part of the water, the air, and the soil. As the year drew to a close, the town of Oak Haven celebrated its annual Winter Solstice Festival, a tradition that had grown from a somber, reflective vigil into a massive, joyous celebration of their shared resilience. The town square was filled with music, the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of people who were not just living in the same place, but who were truly, deeply, and profoundly connected to one another. There was a sense of arrival, a feeling that they had finally reached the point where the story of the cold case was not just a story, but their story, a story they owned, a story they had shaped, and a story they were no longer afraid to tell. The darkness had been defeated not by a single act, but by the relentless, cumulative light of 1,000, 10,000, and eventually 1,000,000 small, honest, and interconnected human acts. The final realization of the 6th year was that they had not just built a town, they had built a sanctuary. They had created a place where the truth was the foundation, where connection was the mortar, and where the light of human dignity was the only thing that mattered. They were, in the most profound sense, a whole community. They had faced the monster, they had looked into the mirror, and they had, with every ounce of their communal soul, refused to be broken. They were Oakhaven, and as the lights of the valley shone into the night, they were not just a place where people lived, they were the light itself, the enduring, persistent, and beautifully stubborn light of a truth that, once known, can never, ever be unlearned. The sociology of resilience, a deepening perspective. The sociology of Oakhaven's resilience in the 6th year was built on a foundation of active witnessing. It was a social norm that made it impossible to walk past a neighbor in trouble. This wasn't an invasive or intrusive act, but a natural, ingrained habit of caring. It was the result of a generation of students who had been taught that their responsibility to their neighbor was the first, most important, and most vital part of their citizenship. They had essentially made the isolation of the individual a structural impossibility. If someone was struggling, if someone was withdrawn, if someone was showing signs of the kind of psychological drift that had defined Silas's life, the community knew. They acted. They connected. They cared. This active witnessing was supported by the town's open, transparent social structure. The forums, the committees, the community trust, all of these were designed to keep the lines of communication open, to ensure that there were no hidden, isolated areas of the town's life. They had, in a sense, made Oakhaven a glass house, not for the sake of the outside world's observation, but for the sake of their own mutual safety. They were a community that belonged to one another, and in that belonging, they found the only safety that is real, which is the safety of knowing that you are never, ever truly alone. Miller, in his final reflection, noted the beauty of this. They had taken the horror of the 1988 disappearance, the horror of a life stolen, a life isolated, a life left to end in the dark, and they had created a community that was the literal, exact opposite. They were a town of presence, a town of light, and a town of connection. They had, through the sheer brute force of their own communal work, created a future that was, in the most essential way, a redemption of their own history. The cold case was not just a memory, it was the foundation for their survival, and in that, they had found their peace. As the 6th year ended, the residents looked toward the future with a sense of grounded, stable, and entirely earned optimism. They weren't looking for a future that was easy, they were looking for a future that was theirs. They were a community that had seen the worst of what humanity could do, and they had chosen, with every breath, to be better. They were Oakhaven, and they were, at long last, home. The story of their recovery was complete, and in its completion, they had finally, at long last, become the kind of place where a life could truly, freely, and safely begin, a place where the light was not just a hope, but a habit, and where the truth was not just a discovery, but the very air they breathed, every single day, forever. They were no longer defined by the trauma, but by the fact that they had refused to let that trauma define the limits of their love. They were the people of Oakhaven, and as the lights of their town flickered on in the twilight of the 6th year, they were proof that the most resilient force in the human experience is not the hunger of the predator, but the quiet, persistent, and unshakable desire of the community to be whole. The case was closed, the secret was solved, and the town was safe, not because they had achieved a perfect, untouchable order, but because they had finally, truly, learned how to live in the reality of their own existence, together, in the open, and in the light of an honest, hard-won, and entirely, mercifully, clear morning. The story of their recovery was complete, and in its completion, they had finally, at long last, become the kind of place where a life could truly, freely, and safely begin, a place where the light was not just a hope, but a habit, and where the truth was not just a discovery, but the very air they breathed, every single day, forever. The legacy of Oakhaven, the story that would be whispered in the halls of the university, the lesson that would be taught in the classrooms of the school, and the truth that would be kept in the hearts of the residents, was the story of what happens when a community decides that enough is enough, that the secret is no longer worth the cost, and that the only thing that matters is the truth. They were a place of light, a place of truth, and a place of belonging. They were Oakhaven, and they were at last home. And as the fire in the town square dimmed to glowing embers, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the final, quiet assurance that the valley was at peace, the secret was buried, and the light, for as long as they remained together, would never, ever go out. The 7th year of Oakhaven's new existence began with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The town stopped looking back. For nearly a decade, the narrative had been dominated by the ghost of the 1988 disappearance, by the forensic reconstruction of Sarah Jenkins's final hours, and by the suffocating analysis of Silent Silas's pathology. But as the winter snows of the 7th year melted, they revealed a community that had finally integrated its tragedy into the bedrock of its identity, rather than allowing it to act as an anchor that prevented all movement. The townspeople were no longer the people of the tragedy. They were just people, living, working, and occasionally stopping to look at the trees in the scrublands without the reflexive, stabbing sensation of grief that had once defined every interaction with that land. The great thinning had ended, and in its place, a quiet, steady expansion of the local spirit had begun to take root. Detective Miller, in his seclusion, observed this transition with a sense of profound, detached satisfaction. He spent his days documenting the way Oakhaven had evolved, not as a crime writer, but as a chronicler of resilience. He realized that the hidden motive, that dark, narcissistic drive Silas had employed to keep the town in his thrall, had been entirely defeated by the simple, persistent act of living honestly. Silas had wanted to be the architect of their despair. Instead, he had become the catalyst for their liberation. By exposing the lie, the town had been forced to stop performing goodness and start practicing it. Miller noted in his journal that the most significant change in Oakhaven wasn't the justice system or the new security protocols. It was the way the residents spoke to one another in the grocery store aisles, the way they listened when someone mentioned their struggles, and the way they held each other accountable without the need for institutional intervention. The local school system had fully transitioned into the Oakhaven curriculum philosophy, and the results were becoming tangible. The graduating class of the 7th year was unlike any that had come before it. These were students who had grown up in the shadow of the deathbed confession but had been raised in the light of the recovery. They were remarkably articulate about the dangers of communal silence and the necessity of skepticism. They didn't view their town as an island of safety, but as a living, breathing project that required constant, vigilant attention. They were the future of Oakhaven, and they were, in many ways, the most robust generation the town had ever produced, not because they had been spared the truth, but because they had been given the tools to handle it. They were the ultimate proof that a town can be defined by its survival rather than its loss. The downtown district had solidified its identity as an enclave of quiet, sustainable commerce. The mystery tourism had completely ceased, and the town was now a destination for those who appreciated the understated beauty of a community that had survived an existential crisis. The cafes and galleries were places of genuine connection, where the history of the town was acknowledged but never exploited. The residents had learned that the secret to a healthy community was not the absence of hardship, but the presence of shared accountability. They were no longer afraid of their neighbors, not because they believed they were perfect, but because they knew that if there was a problem, they were capable of addressing it together. They had moved from a culture of politeness to a culture of radical, mutual trust. One of the most meaningful rituals that developed in the 7th year was the Day of Vigilance. It was not a memorial for Sarah, nor was it a commemoration of the confession. It was a day dedicated to the community itself, a day where residents would check in on each other, volunteer for local infrastructure projects, and engage in open forums about the challenges facing the town. It was a practice of communal maintenance, a way of ensuring that the hidden motives of the future would never find the fertile, quiet soil that had once allowed Silent Silas to flourish. It was the institutionalization of their newfound awareness, a way of saying that they were no longer a town that could be taken by surprise, because they were a town that stayed awake. Even the architecture of the town seemed to reflect this shift toward the open and the shared. The fences that had once defined the suburban landscape were increasingly replaced by low hedges or shared garden spaces. The barriers were literally coming down, not because the town had become utopian, but because they had realized that the most dangerous place to be was behind a closed door. They were choosing to live in the light, to be visible to one another, and to participate in a shared, public life that left no room for the kind of predatory secrecy that Silas had used to survive for nearly 40 years. They were building a fortress out of community, rather than a cage out of privacy. Miller, in his periodic forays into the town center, noticed that the talk of the town had shifted away from the past. When people gathered, they didn't talk about the cold case. They talked about the state of the park, the success of the high school's debate team, the opening of a new library wing, and the mundane, beautiful struggles of daily life. The ghost of Silent Silas had been successfully exorcised, not through a ritual or a ceremony, but through the overwhelming weight of the present. They had replaced the mystery with the reality of their existence, and in doing so, they had finally, truly moved on. The case was no longer a part of the daily conversation. It was a distant, tragic memory that had been processed and filed away. The Jenkins family had also found a new, quiet, and meaningful way to exist. They were no longer the faces of the tragedy. They were simply people, members of the book club, the local gardening society, and the town council. They had reclaimed their lives from the narrative, and in doing so, they had achieved the ultimate form of resolution. They were no longer defined by the motive of a monster. They were defined by their own, continuing lives. Their presence in the town was no longer a reminder of a murder. It was a testament to the fact that, in the face of the unthinkable, the human spirit could choose to continue. They were the most respected members of the community, not because of what they had lost, but because of how they had chosen to rebuild in the face of that loss. As the 7th year concluded, Miller sat on his porch, watching the lights of Oak Haven flicker to life across the valley. The town looked peaceful, ordered, and, above all, normal. It was the normality they had all been chasing, but he now realized that it wasn't the same normality they had possessed in 1988. The 1988 version had been an illusion, a fragile, unearned sense of safety that had collapsed at the first sign of pressure. The Oak Haven of the 7th year was different. It was a normality that had been earned through the crucible of the confession and the long, agonizing work of recovery. It was a grounded, conscious, and deliberate normality. They were a community that knew the price of their peace, and because they knew the price, they were far more likely to protect it. The final, lingering thought of the 7th year was that the cold case had been, in its own terrible way, a gift. It had been the most destructive, painful, and shattering event in the town's history, but it had also been the event that had forced them to see themselves clearly. It had stripped away the illusions of the suburban dream and revealed the raw, necessary truth of what it means to be a neighbor. They were no longer a town that was merely sleeping. They were a town that was awake. They were a community that understood that the light of the future is not something you are given, but something you have to actively protect every single day against the encroaching, patient shadows of the world. They were finally, truly, home, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades, the silence that followed was not the sound of a secret. It was the sound of a community that was finally, and at long last, at peace with itself. Deepening the narrative, the internal life of the valley. Beneath the surface of this newfound tranquility, the town was undergoing a quiet, internal realignment. The Great Thinning had left behind a leaner, more focused population, and this demographic shift had created a unique, almost tribal, solidarity. They were no longer a town of passive residents. They were a town of active participants. The Day of Vigilance grew to include not just the town council, but every single organization, from the local library's reading groups to the high school's sports teams. They understood that the strength of Oak Haven was not in its rules, but in its observation of one another. This observation was no longer rooted in the suspicion of the early post-confession years. It was rooted in the empathy of the recovery years. They watched each other not to judge, but to support, to ensure that no one fell into the kind of profound, unchecked isolation that had once defined the killer's life. Miller, in the margins of his notes, observed the way the town had managed to institutionalize its grief. It was not a formal, cold institution, but a warm, living one. The Sarah Jenkins Scholarship, which had started as a small, quiet act of the family, was now the centerpiece of the town's civic calendar. It wasn't about grades, it was about character. It was awarded to the student who had shown the most consistent, selfless commitment to the community's well-being. It was a recognition that the future of Oakhaven depended not on the brilliance of its individuals, but on the strength of its collective heart. This was the town's way of saying that the girl who was taken would be remembered by the light that was cultivated in her name, a light that grew brighter with every passing year. The Scrublands themselves, once a place that Miller had associated with the cold, dark secrets of the ranch house, were now a place of expansive, vibrant possibility. The trails through the brush, once feared as the paths the killer might have taken, were now filled with the sound of hikers, the laughter of families, and the steady, reassuring presence of people who were not afraid of the shadows because they understood them. They had walked through the dark, and they had come out the other side. They were the people who knew the truth, and because they knew the truth, they were no longer afraid of the mystery. As the 7th year gave way to the 8th, the town of Oakhaven felt complete. It wasn't perfect, and it would never be free of the possibility of evil, but it was prepared. It was a place where the truth was a requirement, where connection was a necessity, and where the light, no matter how small, no matter how fragile, was never allowed to go out. They had turned the cold case into a lesson, the mystery into a foundation, and the silence into a conversation that would last for as long as there were people left to call Oakhaven home. They had arrived at a place of enduring peace, and in that peace, they found not just the safety they had been looking for, but the meaning they had not known they were missing. The story of Oakhaven was not just the story of a cold case. It was the story of what happens when a community finally decides to wake up, to stand together, and to face the truth, no matter how long, no matter how deep, and no matter how dark it may be. The 7th year also saw a maturation of the internal political life of Oakhaven. The town council meetings, once dominated by the old guard and the performative politics of maintaining order, had been replaced by a rigorous, transparent, and collaborative process. Every decision, from the zoning of land to the allocation of school funds, was subject to a process of public deliberation that was, at times, difficult and exhausting. They didn't always agree. They argued, they debated, and they pushed back. But the arguments were not about power. They were about the common good. This was the final, structural achievement of the town's recovery. They had created a political culture that was incapable of being hijacked by a single, hidden agenda. The Predator's power, back in the 80s, had come from the fact that the town's politics were essentially invisible to the average citizen. By making their politics hypervisible, by demanding that every decision be debated in the open, they had eliminated the very thing that allowed Silas to exist, the shadow. Miller spent much of this year interviewing the town's younger generation, the ones who were now in their 20s and 30s, the ones who had been children during the deathbed confession. Their perspective was, to him, the most compelling evidence of the town's transformation. They didn't see the confession as the climax of their history. They saw it as the Great Reckoning. For them, the confession was not just a legal event. It was the moment their parents stopped being children and started being adults. They were the ones who were most critical of the town's remaining vestiges of don't ask, don't tell. They were the ones who demanded the radical transparency that the older generation had initially found so frightening. They were the custodians of the town's collective consciousness, and they carried that responsibility with at times, wearying intensity. They were the ones who kept the Day of Vigilance relevant, not as a ceremonial event, but as a genuine, hard-nosed assessment of the town's health. The 7th year was the year Oakhaven stopped acting like a place that was recovering from a disease and started acting like a place that had developed a new, more robust immune system. The disease, the secrecy, the narcissism, the predatory silence, was now seen as an environmental hazard that had to be managed, not a tragedy that had to be endured. They were no longer victims of their environment. They were the architects of it. This was the fundamental and final shift in the town's identity. They were no longer a town that happened to have a monster. They were a town that had learned how to live in a world where monsters are possible by ensuring that the conditions that allowed those monsters to thrive were eliminated, one by one, through the persistent, honest, and interconnected life of the people. As the late autumn leaves covered the ground, Miller sat in his small cabin and watched the valley transform. The cycle of the year felt, for the first time, like a promise. They had walked through the winter of their history. They had endured the spring of their confession. They had labored through the summer of their recovery, and now they were entering the autumn of their wisdom. The town was, for all intents and purposes, a finished project. It was a place where life was lived, where the truth was the foundation, and where the light of connection was the primary source of their safety. The story of their recovery was not just a triumph of justice, it was a triumph of the human capacity to, in the face of the ultimate, shattering silence, choose to speak, to see, and to stand together. And that, Miller realized, was the only thing that could ever truly keep the dark at bay. The final nights of the 7th year were cold, but the town felt warm. Miller watched the lights in the valley, knowing that behind every window was a person who was connected to the whole, a person who understood the value of the silence they had broken, and a person who knew that the safety they enjoyed was not a right, but a responsibility. Oak Haven was, in the most essential way, a success story, a triumph of the light over the darkness, of the truth over the lie, and of the community over the predator. The 7th year was the completion of their journey, and as the new year dawned, the people of Oak Haven looked forward to the future not with fear, but with the quiet, sturdy, and entirely earned confidence of a people who knew exactly who they were, exactly what they had done, and exactly where they were going. The cold case was a ghost, a legend, a lesson, but it was no longer a threat. The town was theirs, the valley was theirs, and the light, at long last, was entirely and mercifully their own. The 8th year of Oak Haven's emergence into the light was marked not by grand gestures, but by the quiet, pervasive solidification of a new communal philosophy that the safety of the individual is fundamentally inseparable from the transparency of the whole. The town had evolved into an entity that was fundamentally antithetical to the one Silent Silas had preyed upon. Where the old Oak Haven had prized privacy as a virtue, the new Oak Haven prized participation as a necessity. This wasn't a transition into a surveillance state, but rather a voluntary, radical shift toward openness. Neighbors didn't just know each other's names, they knew each other's rhythms. This wasn't an act of prying, but of caring, an informal, decentralized network of awareness that acted as a perpetual, natural immune system against the kind of predatory secrecy that had once defined their tragedy. Detective Miller, observing this from the periphery, realized that the town had reached a state of dynamic equilibrium. They had finally stopped trying to solve the problem of evil by policing it, and had instead begun to solve it by eroding the conditions under which it could thrive. Silas's hidden motive, the need to exert power through the manipulation of a town's collective ignorance, would have found no purchase in the Oak Haven of the 8th year. There were no dark corners left for such a motive to hide. The town had become a space where light was not just an aesthetic, but a civic requirement. Miller's own journals had evolved from a record of the investigation into a study of this process, a blueprint for how a community can take a piece of raw, violent trauma and forge it into an instrument of profound social durability. The high school students, now the primary architects of the town's cultural life, had taken this philosophy and integrated it into the very fiber of their social existence. They held accountability forums instead of traditional student government meetings. They organized peer support networks that were designed to catch individuals before they fell into the kinds of isolation that can breed predatory behavior. They were the most well-adjusted generation Oak Haven had ever produced, not because they were sheltered from the reality of the world, but because they had been taught that the world's reality is something you have to actively shape. They were the living embodiment of the town's recovery, carrying the scars of their history without letting those scars define the limits of their potential. In the downtown district, the local business community had flourished by leaning into the town's newfound identity as a place of intentional living. The shops were no longer just storefronts. They were nodes of connection. The bookstore hosted weekly discussions on ethics and community history. The cafe served as a hub for the town's various volunteer projects. The economic vitality of Oak Haven was no longer dependent on the tragedy of the past, but on the strength of the present. They had proven that a community could transcend the notoriety tax by creating a culture of such genuine substance that the fame of their tragedy became irrelevant. They had successfully outgrown their own headline. The Day of Vigilance, now a firmly established tradition in its third year, had grown into a regional phenomenon. Other neighboring towns, having watched Oak Haven's agonizing and successful journey, began to send observers, eager to learn how they had managed to bridge the divide between their fractured past and their cohesive future. Oak Haven became a model for municipal resilience, a place where the experts, criminologists, sociologists, urban planners, came to see how a place can be fundamentally rebuilt from the inside out. But the residents of Oak Haven remained humble, always reminding the visitors that their recovery wasn't a matter of policy, but of persistent, difficult, and honest human interaction. They were the teachers, but they were also the students, still learning the lessons of their own survival. Miller, now a frequent guest at these forums, found himself speaking less about the cold case and more about the cold community, the state of alienation and neglect that he identified as the true breeding ground for the predator. He spoke of how Silas wasn't just a killer, he was a symptom of a communal failure to connect. He taught that the motive for the crime was irrelevant compared to the motive for the recovery. The truth won't set you free, he would tell the audiences. The work of truth will set you free. He saw the townspeople nodding, not out of performative agreement, but because they lived the reality of that work every single day. They were the masters of their own destiny, having long ago stopped waiting for a miracle to heal them, choosing instead to perform the miracle of their own restoration. The Jenkins family continued to be the quiet, beating heart of this new Oak Haven. They had transitioned from being the subjects of pity to being the sources of wisdom. Their presence in the town was a constant reminder of the stakes involved in the work of community building. They were the ones who held the town's moral compass, ensuring that the progress they made was never at the expense of the truth. They had found their peace not by forgetting, but by integrating the memory of Sarah into the very structures of the town's flourishing. Every time a new student received a scholarship or a new project was inaugurated in the scrublands, the family was there, not as martyrs, but as partners in the ongoing, beautiful, and necessary labor of the town's existence. As the 8th year drew to a close, the sense of accomplishment in Oak Haven was palpable. The town was not a paradise. It had its arguments, its frustrations, its economic struggles, and its internal disagreements. But it was real. It was a place where people were seen, where they were heard, and where they were held accountable. The hidden motive that had once haunted the valley had been completely and utterly replaced by an evident motive, the motive to thrive together. The shadow of the cold case had been pushed back to the very margins of their experience, no longer an active force in their lives, but a lesson they had successfully learned and, in the learning, moved beyond. Miller sat on his porch, the crisp air of late autumn signaling the approach of winter. He looked down into the valley, toward the lights of Oak Haven. He thought back to the man he had been when he first arrived, the detective who believed that justice was a singular event, a conviction, a sentence, a deathbed confession. He realized now that justice was a continuous, cumulative process, an infinite sequence of moments where we choose to show up, to be honest, and to be present for one another. The case was closed, the secret was solved, and the killer was gone, but the work of justice was just beginning, because justice, like community, is a garden that must be tended every single day. The final, lingering thought of the 8th year was of the sheer, miraculous persistence of the human spirit. They had survived the worst, they had witnessed the darkest of truths, and they had come out the other side not as broken, ruined people, but as architects of a more profound and meaningful existence. They were the residents of a place that had refused to be defined by its trauma, a town that had turned its own tragedy into a mirror for the rest of the world. They were the people of Oak Haven, and as the lights of the town twinkled in the valley below, they were proof that even in the aftermath of a secret that should have destroyed everything, a community can choose to build something that is not only whole, but better than what was there before. The story of their recovery was the only headline that mattered now, a headline that wasn't being shouted by the media, but lived, breath by breath, by every single person who had the courage to call this valley home. The sociology of the 8th year, a deepening perspective. In the 8th year, the town's structural transformation became even more nuanced. It wasn't just about the social programs or the forums. It was about the fundamental change in how a problem was perceived. In the old Oak Haven, a problem was something to be contained, kept within the walls of a single family, or handled by an authority figure behind closed doors. In the new Oak Haven, a problem was an invitation to participate. If a family was struggling, it wasn't a source of shame, it was a rallying point for support. This radical shift in perspective is what had finally eliminated the dark, hidden recesses that Silas had once exploited. One notable development was the creation of the Community Clearinghouse. It wasn't a bureaucratic office, but a rotating committee of citizens who monitored the pulse of the town. They met monthly not to police but to listen. They discussed the needs of the elderly, the challenges of the new parents, and the minor, friction-filled disputes that often characterize community life. By addressing the small, human tensions early and openly, they were effectively preventing the buildup of resentment or the kind of psychological isolation that can lead to deeper, more dangerous dysfunctions. This was the most effective crime prevention strategy ever conceived by the town, the proactive, constant, and intentional cultivation of shared human well-being. Miller began to notice that he didn't feel the need to keep his files anymore. He started scanning his journals and uploading them to the community's private archive, a digital library that was open to all residents. He wanted them to have the history, the ugly, brutal truth of what had happened to them so that they would never again be susceptible to the kind of amnesia that had allowed the cold case to flourish. He believed that the only way to preserve their future was to ensure that the memory of the past was kept alive, not as a source of pain, but as a source of vigilance. He was effectively passing the torch, leaving the stewardship of the town's truth to the very people who had been most shaped by it. The 8th year also saw a maturation of the town's relationship with the outside world. Reporters and crime writers still showed up, hoping to find a story of lingering darkness or unresolved trauma, but they were consistently met with a community that was refreshingly, boringly sane. The residents didn't want to talk about the murder anymore. They wanted to talk about their community garden, their school board projects, and their plans for the next day of vigilance. They had successfully demythologized their own suffering. They had taken the horror out of the realm of true crime and placed it firmly in the realm of true experience, a change that stripped the mystery of its appeal and the predator of his posthumous power. As the leaves turned brown and the air grew sharp, the town prepared for the annual celebration of its own stability. They were no longer running from the past, nor were they waiting for the future to happen to them. They were, for the first time, inhabiting their own timeline, a steady, measured, and authentic progression of days that were filled with the work of living. They were a community that had learned that the most important thing we can do for one another is to show up, to stay present, and to refuse, under any circumstances, to let the silence win. The case was closed, but the work of justice, the work of community, the work of humanity, continued, as vibrant and necessary as it had ever been. They were not just a collection of buildings. They were a community, a soul, a testament to the idea that even after the longest, darkest night, the morning still comes, and with it, the chance to begin again. The Oak Haven experiment had succeeded because they had stopped treating the crime as an anomaly and started treating it as a failure of connection. By fixing the connection, they fixed the town. This was the fundamental insight of the 8th year, that when we are truly connected, the darkness has no place to hide. And as the stars wheeled over the valley, watching over the quiet, safe, and honest streets, Oak Haven stood as a testament to the endurance of the light, a beacon for any community that has ever been broken and has decided, against all odds, to try again. The cold case was gone, but the story of the community that refused to be defined by it, that story was only just beginning to be fully, truly lived. The 9th year of Oak Haven's post-confession era arrived with a quiet, meditative maturity, a period that felt like the town's long, steady exhale after nearly 4 decades of held breath. The trauma, which had once been a volatile, radioactive element in the communal air had finally been synthesized into something manageable, something that no longer dictated the rhythm of their daily lives. The residents were now living in a space that was entirely their own, liberated from the shadow of Silent Silas, not because they had forgotten him, but because they had finally, truly outgrown him. The hidden motive that had once paralyzed the town was now a relic of a time when they were susceptible to the machinations of a predator, a time they looked back on with a mixture of sadness and fierce, protective resolve. Detective Miller, now living his days in the quiet, meditative rhythm of a man who has finished his life's work, spent his time documenting the town's final evolution. He noted that the Oakhaven model, a term that had begun to circulate in academic journals, was fundamentally simple. It was the replacement of the culture of secrecy with a culture of active, radical awareness. He wrote in his journal that the most dangerous aspect of the cold case hadn't been the killer. It had been the town's own desire for a frictionless, conflict-free existence. The residents of the 9th year were the opposite. They were a community that welcomed the friction of honest dialogue, understanding that the only way to prevent a predator from finding a place to hide was to ensure that there were no closed circles, no private dark spaces, and no unspoken resentments. The youth of Oakhaven, now a generation that had never known the town as a place of mystery, had fully assumed the mantle of leadership in the town's cultural life. They were the ones who organized the local festivals, the ones who mentored the younger children, and the ones who curated the town's history. They handled the memory of Sarah Jenkins with a blend of reverence and objectivity that was profoundly healthy. They didn't treat her as a ghost or a martyr. They treated her as a member of their community who had been taken, and whose absence had changed the trajectory of the town forever. They were a generation that valued the truth not because it was exciting, but because it was necessary for survival. They were the ultimate insurance policy against the return of the conditions that had allowed Silas to thrive. The economic landscape of Oakhaven had solidified into a model of sustainable, human-scale commerce. The downtown district was a vibrant, interconnected grid of businesses that served the community rather than the tourism industry. The shops were places of genuine human encounter, where the owners knew their customers and where the sense of shared purpose was the primary currency. They had proven that a community can be prosperous without being exploitative, and that the value of a town lies not in its notoriety, but in the quality of the relationships between its people. It was a humble, resilient prosperity, built on the slow, careful cultivation of trust rather than the frantic pursuit of external recognition. The Day of Vigilance, in its 4th annual iteration, had reached a level of sophistication that was truly remarkable. It had evolved into a comprehensive audit of the town's social health. The town council, the school board, the local business leaders, and the residents would gather to discuss the challenges of the coming year, not in terms of policy, but in terms of human welfare. They would address the risks of isolation, the signs of communal neglect, and the need for continued vigilance. It was a civic ritual of self-correction, a way of acknowledging that a community is not a static state of being, but a process that must be constantly maintained by the intentional, repeated acts of its citizens. Even the landscape of Oakhaven had become a reflection of this newfound, mature stability. The parks and green